Picture this. It's early 1942, and the world looks like it's ending for the Allied cause. German troops stand mere miles from Moscow's gates, their swastika banners fluttering in the brutal Russian winter wind. Japanese forces have swept through the Pacific like a tidal wave, their empire stretching from the frozen wastes of the Aleutian Islands all the way to the steaming jungles of Burma. In North Africa, Rommel's Africa Corps dances across the desert sands, threatening to seize the Suez Canal and the oil fields beyond. Britain stands battered and bruised, its cities still smouldering from the Blitz, while America is reeling from the smoking wreckage at Pearl Harbor. The Axis powers appear unstoppable, a dark trinity of fascist might that seems destined to carve up the entire world among themselves. Yet just 3.5 years later, in May of 1945, that seemingly invincible Axis lies in complete ruin. Berlin burns as Soviet soldiers plant their red banner atop the Reichstags. Mussolini hangs upside down from a Milan gas station, and within months, atomic fire will rain down on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the Japanese empire to its knees. The transformation is so complete, so total, that it almost defies belief. How did this happen? How did the Allies achieve what once seemed absolutely impossible? The story you've probably heard is simple, almost comforting in its straightforwardness. Maybe you've been told that Allied victory was inevitable because of America's industrial might, or perhaps you've heard that it all came down to Hitler's strategic blunders, or maybe someone told you it was simply about having more men and more guns. But here's the truth that most casual histories miss. The Allied victory wasn't about one single factor. It wasn't about one brilliant decision or one fatal enemy mistake. The real story is far more complex, far more fascinating, and frankly, far more impressive than any simple explanation could capture. What we're going to explore today is the intricate web of interconnected factors that led to Allied victory. We're going to peel back the layers of this massive global conflict and examine how industrial production, intelligence breakthroughs, strategic decisions, technological innovation, leadership qualities, and even geographic advantages all wove together into something greater than the sum of their parts. We'll look at how the arsenal of democracy built the weapons of war faster than the Axis could destroy them. We'll dive into the shadowy world of codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who gave Allied commanders an almost supernatural ability to predict enemy moves. We'll examine how Soviet resilience and German overreach turned the Eastern Front into a meat grinder that consumed the Wehrmacht. We'll explore how the strategic bombing campaign systematically dismantled the Axis war economy, and how Allied leadership learned, adapted, and ultimately outmaneuvered their opponents. At every turn, this isn't just military history. This is the story of how determination, ingenuity, and the careful orchestration of multiple advantages defeated what once seemed like an unstoppable tide of totalitarian aggression. So settle in, because we're about to embark on a comprehensive journey through the real reasons the Allies won the Second World War. When President Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke to the American people in one of his famous fireside chats on December 29, 1940, he used a phrase that would come to define America's role in the Second World War. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared, his voice crackling over millions of radio sets across the nation. At the time, these were just words, a promise, a vision of what might be possible. But over the next 5 years, America would transform those words into the most staggering display of industrial might the world had ever witnessed. Let's put some numbers on the table, because the scale of American production during the war years is almost beyond comprehension. By the time the war ended in 1945, American factories had produced more than 300,000 aircraft. 300,000. That's not just fighters and bombers, mind you, but everything from nimble Mustangs to massive B-29 superfortresses, from carrier-based Hellcats to transport planes that kept armies supplied across impossible distances. To put that in perspective, in 1939, the United States produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. Within 5 years, production had increased by a factor of 100. But aircraft were just the beginning of this industrial miracle. American shipyards, many of them built from scratch after Pearl Harbor, launched thousands upon thousands of vessels. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines in an average of just 42 days, some even faster. The record was held by the S. Robert E. Peary, assembled in an astounding 4 days and 15 hours. These weren't flimsy vessels either. These were ocean-going freighters that could carry thousands of tons of supplies across submarine-infested waters. American yards produced nearly 6,000 of these workhorses, and that's not even counting the hundreds of aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, submarines, and landing craft that also slid into the water during those frantic years. The tank production numbers tell a similar story of overwhelming industrial supremacy. American factories churned out close to 90,000 tanks and tank destroyers during the war. Now, you might hear critics point out that German tanks like the Tiger or Panzer were technologically superior to American Shermans. And you know what? They're absolutely right about that. A Tiger tank could shred a Sherman in a one-on-one duel. But here's the thing those critics miss. For every Tiger that rolled off a German assembly line, America produced 5 Shermans. 6, 10. The Germans might win individual tank battles, but they couldn't win the war of production. American forces didn't need to build the best tank. They needed to build enough good tanks that they could overwhelm any opposition through sheer weight of numbers. And it wasn't just about the big-ticket items like planes, ships, and tanks. America produced millions of trucks, without which modern mechanized warfare simply couldn't function. The Soviet Union, despite its massive industrial capacity, relied heavily on American trucks to keep its armies mobile. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov would later admit that without American trucks, the Red Army would have been unable to conduct the massive offensive operations that drove the Germans back across Eastern Europe. American factories produced over 2.5 million trucks during the war, and a significant portion of those went to Allied nations through the Lend-Lease program. Small arms? America produced more than 3 million M1 Garand rifles, considered by many to be the finest infantry rifle of the war. General George Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. Ammunition. American industry produced 44 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 44 billion. Try to wrap your mind around that number. That's more than 6,000 bullets for every man, woman, and child living in America at the time. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where we start to understand why American industrial production was so crucial to Allied victory. It wasn't just the raw numbers, impressive as they were. It was the speed at which American industry transitioned from peacetime to wartime production. In 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States, American military production was still relatively modest, but within a year, the conversion was well underway. Automobile factories that had been churning out Chevys and Fords retooled their assembly lines to produce tanks and aircraft engines. Refrigerator manufacturers started making machine guns. A company that had specialized in making stoves began producing helmets. The entire productive capacity of the American economy shifted gears with remarkable speed. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It was carefully orchestrated by newly created government agencies like the War Production Board, established in January of 1942. These agencies had sweeping powers to direct industrial production, allocate raw materials, and essentially commandeer the entire American economy for the war effort. But they also had to do this without completely destroying civilian morale and living standards. It was a delicate balancing act, but one that America managed with remarkable success. Unlike Germany, which didn't fully mobilize its economy for total war until 1943, and unlike the Soviet Union, which suffered catastrophic losses of industrial capacity when Germany invaded, America's industrial heartland remained secure and untouched throughout the entire conflict. The geographic isolation of the United States turned out to be an enormous strategic advantage. While British factories were being pounded by German bombers and Soviet factories were being hastily evacuated ahead of advancing German armies, American factories hummed along without interruption. No bombs fell on Detroit. No artillery shells landed on the shipyards of Newport News. The vast oceans that separated America from both major theaters of war meant that American workers could focus entirely on production without worrying about air raids or invasion. This uninterrupted production was absolutely crucial to the Allied war effort. Now, compare this to the Axis powers. Germany, despite having been preparing for war throughout the 1930s, never matched American production levels. This wasn't because German industry was backward or inefficient. German engineering and manufacturing were world-class. The problem was scale and resources. Germany simply didn't have access to the raw materials needed to sustain unlimited production. As the war progressed and Allied bombing intensified, German factories struggled to maintain output. By 1944, strategic bombing had reduced German tank production by 35%, aircraft production by 31%, and truck production by 42%. The oil campaign, which we'll discuss in more detail later, essentially paralyzed German mechanized forces by cutting off their fuel supply. Japan faced even more severe limitations. Island nation that it was, Japan lacked many of the raw materials essential for modern industrial warfare. They had conquered vast territories across Asia and the Pacific precisely to secure access to oil, rubber, and other strategic resources. But even with these conquered territories, Japan could never approach American production levels. At its wartime peak, Japan produced around 28,000 aircraft throughout the entire conflict. America produced that many in 3 months. Japanese shipyards could never replace the losses inflicted by American submarines and aircraft. Every carrier lost, every battleship sunk, represented an irreplaceable blow to Japanese naval power. Meanwhile, American yards kept launching ship after ship after ship. Italy, the third major Axis power, barely mobilized its economy for war at all. Mussolini had grand visions of restoring the Roman Empire, but he didn't have the industrial base to back up those ambitions. Italian factories produced approximately 12,000 aircraft during the war, less than what America could build in a single month by 1944. Italian military equipment was often outdated and inadequate, and Italian forces found themselves constantly dependent on German support to bail them out of military disasters. But American production wasn't just about quantity. Quality mattered too, and American industry proved remarkably adept at improving designs and incorporating lessons learned from combat. The B-17 Flying Fortress that entered service in 1941 was a capable aircraft. The B-17G that rolled off production lines in 1944 was a vastly improved machine, with better defensive armament, upgraded engines, and enhanced bomb sights. The early model Sherman tank had significant vulnerabilities, particularly its propensity to catch fire when hit. Later models incorporated wet ammunition storage and other modifications that dramatically improved crew survivability. American industry didn't just produce weapons in massive quantities. It continuously refined and improved those weapons based on combat feedback. This ability to learn and adapt extended beyond just the weapons themselves. American industry revolutionized production techniques during the war. Assembly line methods pioneered by Henry Ford were applied to weapons production with spectacular results. Welding techniques improved dramatically, cutting production time and improving structural strength. Quality control methods became more sophisticated. Worker training programs ensured that even people with no previous manufacturing experience could quickly become productive members of the war effort. Women flooded into factories by the millions, taking on jobs that had traditionally been reserved for men. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda figure. She represented millions of real women who proved absolutely essential to American industrial success. The financial resources America brought to bear were equally staggering. The United States spent over $300 billion on the war effort, equivalent to several trillion in today's money. This wasn't just money thrown at the problem. It was carefully invested in infrastructure, in training, in research and development, in logistics. America could afford to make mistakes, to pursue technological dead ends, to build experimental weapons that never saw combat, because the industrial and financial capacity was so vast that even these wastes represented only a small fraction of the total effort. And here's perhaps the most remarkable thing about American industrial production: it never came at the cost of civilian welfare. Unlike Germany, where the civilian population faced increasing hardship as the war progressed, or the Soviet Union, where millions of civilians starved to death, or Britain, which survived on strict rationing, American civilians actually saw their standard of living improve during the war years. Unemployment disappeared. Wages rose. Yes, certain goods were rationed. And yes, people made sacrifices. But Americans never faced the kind of deprivation that other nations endured. This meant that there was never any serious threat of a morale collapse on the home front. American workers remained motivated and productive throughout the conflict. The genius of American industrial mobilization was that it created a self-reinforcing cycle of production. More factories meant more weapons meant more military success. More military success meant more resources captured from the enemy, and more access to global markets. More resources meant even more production. By 1944, the industrial might of the United States was so overwhelming that it essentially guaranteed Allied victory. The Axis simply couldn't match American production, couldn't replace their losses at anywhere near the rate America couldn't sustain the kind of attritional warfare that industrial capacity enabled. When General William Knudsen, head of the Office of Production Management, famously said, "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible," he wasn't exaggerating. He was stating a simple, undeniable truth. The arsenal of democracy had buried the Axis under mountains of steel, aluminum, rubber, and lead. And this industrial supremacy formed one of the fundamental pillars of Allied victory, a pillar without which all the brilliant strategies and courageous fighting in the world might not have been enough. But raw American production power alone wasn't enough to defeat the Axis. Those weapons, supplies, and resources had to actually reach the nations fighting on the front lines. This is where one of the most consequential programs in American history comes into play, a program that President Roosevelt called an act to promote the defense of the United States, but which history would remember as Lend-Lease. The origins of Lend-Lease lie in Britain's desperate situation in early 1941. By December of 1940, Britain stood virtually alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen. The Soviet Union was still allied with Germany through the Nazi-Soviet Pact. America remained officially neutral, constrained by powerful, isolationist sentiment. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, watching his nation's gold reserves and currency drain away as Britain purchased American war materials, knew that a crisis was approaching. On December 8, 1940, Churchill wrote a lengthy letter to Roosevelt, laying out Britain's situation with stark honesty. "The moment approaches," Churchill wrote, "when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies." Roosevelt faced a dilemma. American public opinion wasn't ready to enter the war directly. The nightmare of the First World War still haunted Americans, who had watched 50,000 of their young men die in what many considered a pointless European conflict. But Roosevelt understood that a Nazi-dominated Europe would pose an existential threat to American security. He needed a way to help Britain without technically entering the war. His solution was ingenious. At a press conference in December 1940, Roosevelt explained his concept with a homely metaphor. "If your neighbor's house is on fire," he said, "and he needs your garden hose to fight the flames, you don't haggle with him about the price. You lend him the hose, and you figure out compensation after the fire is out." This simple metaphor helped convince Americans that aiding Britain wasn't about altruism or idealism. It was about self-interest and national security. On March 11, 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, and Roosevelt signed it into law that same day. The legislation gave the president unprecedented authority to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of war materials to any nation whose defense he deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Payment could be deferred and could take forms other than cash. In practical terms, this meant America could supply its allies with whatever they needed without demanding immediate payment. The scale of the Lend-Lease program ultimately reached staggering proportions. Between March 1941 and September 1945, when the program ended, the United States distributed over $50 billion worth of supplies. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to more than $700 billion in today's dollars. This wasn't just weapons and ammunition, though there was plenty of that. Lend-Lease provided food, raw materials, industrial equipment, medical supplies, vehicles, communications equipment, and countless other items essential to waging modern war. Britain was the first and largest recipient of Lend-Lease aid, receiving over $31 billion worth of supplies. This aid quite literally kept Britain in the fight during 1941 and 1942. American tanks reinforced British armoured forces in North Africa. American aircraft supplemented the Royal Air Force. American food helped feed the British population under rationing. American machine tools helped British factories maintain production despite bombing damage. Without Lend-Lease, Britain might well have been forced to negotiate a separate peace with Germany, leaving America to face the Axis alone. The program didn't just help Britain survive, it enabled Britain to build up forces for offensive operations. But while British Lend-Lease gets most of the attention in Western histories, the aid sent to the Soviet Union may have been even more strategically significant. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, Soviet forces were caught completely unprepared. In the first months of the invasion, Soviet losses were catastrophic. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were destroyed. Vast industrial regions fell under German occupation. The Soviet Union appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Into this desperate situation came American aid. The first Lend-Lease protocol with the Soviet Union was signed in October 1941, and shipments began flowing through several dangerous routes. The northern route went by convoy to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, running the gauntlet of German U-boats and aircraft based in Norway. The Persian corridor route went through Iran after British and Soviet forces jointly occupied that country. The Pacific route brought supplies to Soviet Pacific ports, though this route was severely limited by the fact that the Soviet Union and Japan were not at war until 1945. Despite the dangers and difficulties, American supplies kept flowing. What exactly did America send to the Soviet Union? Over the course of the war, Lend-Lease to the Soviets included more than 14,000 aircraft, including fighters like the P-39 Era Cobra, which Soviet pilots found particularly effective. More than 7,000 tanks bolstered Soviet armored formations. Most critically, over 400,000 trucks and jeeps provided the Soviet army with motorized mobility it couldn't have achieved through its own production. Soviet forces were spectacularly successful at producing tanks and artillery, but they struggled to build enough trucks to sustain offensive operations. American vehicles filled this crucial gap. But the impact of Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union went far beyond just the finished military equipment. American shipments included millions of tons of raw materials. steel, aluminum, copper. These metals were absolutely essential for Soviet weapons production, and American supplies made up a huge proportion of Soviet access to these materials. According to Soviet records, American Lend-Lease provided over half the aluminum used by the Soviet Union during the war and more than half of the aviation fuel. Without high-octane American aviation gasoline, Soviet fighters and bombers would have been severely handicapped in their performance. American Lend-Lease also propped up the Soviet railway system, which was absolutely critical to the Soviet war effort. American shipments included thousands of locomotives and hundreds of thousands of rail cars. These enabled the Soviets to move men and materials across the vast distances of the Eastern Front. American supplies even included tons of rails themselves, helping the Soviets maintain and expand their railway network despite the destruction caused by the war. One Soviet economic official would later estimate that without Lend-Lease railway equipment, Soviet rail transport might have experienced a complete breakdown, which would have been catastrophic for the Soviet war effort. Perhaps even more significant than the military equipment were the less glamorous but absolutely essential supplies. American Lend-Lease provided millions of pairs of boots for Soviet soldiers. It provided vast quantities of food, including over 3 million tons of provisions. This food helped prevent mass starvation in Soviet cities and kept Soviet soldiers fed even during the most desperate periods of the war. American Lend-Lease provided medical supplies, communications equipment, machine tools, industrial equipment, and countless other items that the hard-pressed Soviet economy struggled to produce. Now, here's where things get interesting from a historical perspective. After the war, during the Cold War period, Soviet historians consistently downplayed the importance of Lend-Lease. They claimed it represented only a tiny fraction of Soviet war production, that it had minimal impact on the outcome of the war, that the Soviet Union could have won without American aid. These claims served an ideological purpose, supporting the narrative that the Soviet Union had single-handedly defeated Nazi Germany through its own strength and determination. But that's not what Soviet leaders said during the war itself. Joseph Stalin, speaking at the Tehran Conference in November 1943, made a striking admission. He told Roosevelt that American production was the key to victory, that the war was a war of engines and octane, and that without American supplies, we would have lost this war. Nikita Khrushchev, who was intimately involved in the war effort as a political commissar, wrote in his memoirs that without American Lend-Lease trucks, the Soviet army would not have been capable of the massive offensive operations of 1944 and 45. Even years later, when Cold War tensions ran high, Khrushchev admitted that without American aid, the Soviet Union probably could not have survived the German onslaught. Modern historians, with access to Soviet archives that were opened after the Cold War, have confirmed that Lend-Lease was absolutely crucial to Soviet survival and eventual victory. It didn't win the war for the Soviets. Soviet soldiers still did the actual fighting, still endured unimaginable hardship, still demonstrated extraordinary courage and resilience. But Lend-Lease gave them the tools they needed to fight effectively. It kept them supplied, mobile, and capable of offensive operations. Without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union might have been forced into a purely defensive posture, unable to drive the Germans back toward Berlin. China was another significant recipient of Lend-Lease aid, receiving over $1.5 billion worth of supplies. China's war against Japan, which had begun in 1937, tied down huge numbers of Japanese troops that might otherwise have been deployed against American forces in the Pacific. American aid to China, delivered over the famous Burma Road and later by air over the Hump, helped keep Chinese forces in the fight despite overwhelming odds and horrific casualties. The Free French movement under Charles de Gaulle received substantial aid, helping French forces continue to fight even after the fall of France. Smaller Allied nations, from Australia to New Zealand to Poland's government in exile, all received American support through Lend-Lease. The program helped create a truly global coalition against the Axis powers, but Lend-Lease wasn't a one-way street. Allied nations provided what was called reverse Lend-Lease to American forces. Britain provided bases, facilities, and supplies to American forces stationed in the United Kingdom. Australia and New Zealand provided similar support in the Pacific Theatre. Overall, reverse Lend-Lease totaled about $8 billion, with Britain providing the lion's share. This reverse flow helped offset some of the costs of American aid and demonstrated that the Allied war effort really was a cooperative endeavor. The logistics of Lend-Lease were almost as impressive as the scale of the aid itself. Ships had to be loaded, convoys organized, routes planned. Materials had to be tracked, priorities established, bottlenecks identified and resolved. The Office of Lend-Lease Administration, created specifically to manage this massive program, employed thousands of people working around the clock to keep supplies flowing to Allied nations. It was one of the most ambitious logistical undertakings in human history, and its success was absolutely vital to Allied victory. What made Lend-Lease so strategically brilliant was that it allowed America to contribute to the war effort even before Pearl Harbor brought the nation directly into the conflict. While American soldiers weren't yet fighting and dying, American factory workers were producing the weapons and supplies that kept Britain and the Soviet Union in the fight. When America did enter the war, Lend-Lease meant that Allied forces were already well supplied and that production pipelines were already established. The program also had significant diplomatic benefits. It created ties of obligation and cooperation between the United States and its allies. It gave America considerable influence over Allied strategy and planning. It demonstrated American commitment to defeating the Axis, which helped maintain Allied morale even during the darkest days of the war. And it laid the groundwork for the post-war international order, establishing America as the arsenal and banker of the free world. Critics of Lend-Lease, both at the time and since, have argued that the program was essentially a giveaway, that America never received adequate compensation for the aid provided, and it's true that the financial settlements after the war were far less than the nominal value of the supplies sent. Britain didn't finish paying off its Lend-Lease debts until 2006. The Soviet Union never paid most of what was originally claimed, but this criticism misses the point. Lend-Lease wasn't meant to be a profitable business transaction. It was an investment in Allied victory, and judged by that standard, it was spectacularly successful. The supplies sent through Lend-Lease helped defeat the Axis powers at a fraction of the cost that would have been required if America had been forced to fight alone. Lend-Lease represented a new model of international cooperation in wartime. Previous wars had seen allies negotiate complex financial arrangements, demand immediate payment, and squabble over costs even while fighting common enemies. Lend-Lease cut through all that. It said essentially, "We'll figure out payment later. Right now, let's focus on winning the war." This approach helped create a unified Allied effort that the Axis, with their fractious and uncoordinated alliance, could never match. The program also demonstrated the enormous productive and logistical capabilities of the United States. America could not only supply its own massive military forces, but could simultaneously supply several other major nations as well. This was an achievement that left both allies and enemies stunned. It made clear to everyone, including the Axis powers, that America possessed resources on a scale that simply couldn't be matched. When Soviet Marshal Zhukov planned an offensive, he knew he could count on American trucks to move his armies. When the Royal Air Force launched bombing raids over Germany, many of those bombers were American-built. When Chinese forces fought Japanese invaders, they used American weapons and ate American food. Lend-Lease wasn't the only reason the Allies won World War II, but it was an absolutely essential component of that victory. It kept Britain fighting when Britain stood alone. It gave the Soviet Union the tools to survive and eventually triumph on the Eastern Front. It maintained resistance to Japanese aggression across Asia. Without Lend-Lease, the map of Allied victory would look very different. The program stands as one of the most successful strategic investments in military history, a testament to American industrial might, and a crucial pillar supporting ultimate Allied victory. If industrial production and Lend-Lease were the sinews of Allied victory, then the Eastern Front was where those sinews were tested in the most brutal and unforgiving conditions imaginable. What happened between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union from June 1941 to May 1945 wasn't just another theatre of the Second World War. It was the decisive theatre, the place where more than 80% of German military casualties occurred, where the largest battles in human history were fought, where the outcome of the entire conflict was ultimately determined. The story begins with one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in military history. Adolf Hitler, convinced that the Soviet Union was a ramshackle state held together only by terror, believed he could knock the Soviets out of the war in a matter of months. His famous quote captures this arrogance perfectly. "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." This belief shaped German planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which launched on June 22nd, 1941. The initial German success seemed to validate Hitler's assessment. German forces advanced with terrifying speed, employing the blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed Poland in weeks and France in 40 days. Within months, German armies had penetrated hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. They captured millions of Soviet soldiers in vast encirclement battles. They destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks and aircraft. Cities like Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk fell to German forces. By December, German advance units stood just 12 miles from the Kremlin in Moscow. From a purely operational perspective, Barbarossa's opening phase was brilliantly executed, but Hitler and his generals had made several fundamental errors that would eventually prove fatal. First, they had catastrophically underestimated Soviet resilience and the Soviet Union's ability to absorb losses that would have destroyed any other nation. The Soviet Union lost more soldiers in the first 6 months of Barbarossa than the combined total of all American casualties in all theaters throughout the entire war. And yet, the Soviet army kept fighting. New armies materialized from the vast Soviet reserves. Factories evacuated from Western Russia ahead of German advances were reassembled beyond the Ural Mountains and began producing weapons again within months. The Soviet system, brutal and totalitarian as it was, proved far more resilient than Hitler had imagined. Second, the Germans had failed to prepare for a winter campaign. They genuinely believed the war would be over before winter arrived. When winter did come, German forces found themselves fighting in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees, wearing summer uniforms and using equipment that wasn't winterized. Weapons froze. Vehicles wouldn't start. Fuel congealed in tanks. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, equipped and trained for winter warfare, launched a counter-offensive in December 1941 that drove the Germans back from Moscow's gates. For the first time since the war began, the seemingly unstoppable German war machine had been stopped and pushed back. Third, Hitler's interference in operational decisions proved increasingly disastrous. His insistence on achieving multiple objectives simultaneously meant that German forces were spread across an enormous front without clear priorities. The debate about whether to push for Moscow or divert forces to Ukraine and the Caucasus resulted in compromises that satisfied no one and achieved none of their goals completely. As the war progressed, Hitler's interference became more pronounced and more harmful, overruling his professional military commanders and making decisions based on ideology or intuition rather than military logic. The fourth and perhaps most fundamental error was logistical. The distances involved in the Eastern Front were simply staggering. German supply lines stretched for thousands of miles, much of it over poor roads that turned to mud in fall and spring. The German army, for all its modern equipment, still relied heavily on horses for transport. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, their supply situation became increasingly critical. By the time they reached the outskirts of Moscow, many German units were critically short of ammunition, fuel, and even food. The Soviet strategy of scorched earth, destroying everything of value as they retreated, exacerbated these problems. But if we're going to understand why the Eastern Front was so crucial to Allied victory, we need to focus on the battle that many historians consider the true turning point of the entire war: Stalingrad. The battle for this city on the Volga River, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943, became the most savage urban combat in military history. Hitler fixated on Stalingrad partly because of its symbolic significance as the city bearing Stalin's name, and partly because it was an important industrial and transport center. Soviet leaders understood that losing Stalingrad would be a psychological and strategic catastrophe. Both sides poured resources into the fight with reckless abandon. The battle devolved into house-to-house, room-to-room, sometimes hand-to-hand combat. Soviet defenders famously said, "There is no land beyond the Volga," meaning retreat was impossible. They would fight to the death. The casualty figures from Stalingrad are almost incomprehensible. Estimates suggest that the Axis forces suffered around 850,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. Soviet casualties were even higher, with estimates ranging from over 1 million military personnel killed, wounded, or missing. The city itself was reduced to rubble. The average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier in Stalingrad has been estimated at just 24 hours. But the strategic significance of Stalingrad went far beyond the immediate battle. The Soviet victory demonstrated that German forces could not only be stopped, but could be destroyed. The entire German Sixth Army, once considered an elite formation, was encircled and eventually forced to surrender. This was the first time an entire German army had been lost. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. German soldiers began to fear encirclement and began to question their leadership. Soviet soldiers gained confidence that they could defeat the Germans. The destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad also had profound strategic implications. The Germans had lost over 200,000 experienced soldiers, along with enormous amounts of equipment. These losses came at a time when Germany was already stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder, consuming German manpower at an unsustainable rate. Following Stalingrad, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviet side. The Germans would launch one more major offensive at Kursk in July 1943, but that would be their last. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history, with more than 6,000 tanks engaged. The Soviets, warned of German intentions through intelligence sources, prepared elaborate defenses. When the Germans attacked, they ran into a meat grinder of Soviet defensive positions. After 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the German advance had been stopped cold. From Kursk onward, Soviet forces were almost continuously on the offensive. They pushed German forces back across Ukraine, liberated Belarus, drove through the Baltic states, overran the Balkans, and eventually smashed their way into Germany itself. Soviet offensives like Operation Bagration in summer 1944 were conducted on a scale that dwarfed even D-Day. Bagration destroyed more than 20 German divisions and opened the way for the Soviet advance into Poland and ultimately Germany. The casualty figures from the Eastern Front are so staggering that they almost lose meaning. The Soviet Union suffered somewhere around 11 million military deaths and somewhere between 12 and 20 million civilian deaths. Germany and its allies lost nearly 4 million military personnel on the Eastern Front. These numbers are approximate because the chaos and destruction made accurate record-keeping impossible, but they give a sense of the horrific scale of the fighting. Every German division fighting in the east was a division that couldn't be used to oppose Allied forces in other theatres. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Germans had roughly 58 divisions in the west. On the Eastern Front, they had over 150 divisions. The bulk of German military power was tied down trying to hold back the Soviet advance. Without the Eastern Front bleeding German forces white, the Allies would have faced a much more difficult fight in Western Europe. The Soviet contribution to Allied victory went beyond just killing Germans and destroying German equipment, crucial as that was. Soviet resistance gave Britain time to rebuild after Dunkirk. It gave America time to mobilize its industrial power. It drew German attention and resources away from other theatres. When Rommel needed reinforcements in North Africa, those reinforcements were tied down on the Eastern Front. When Germany needed fighters to defend against Allied strategic bombing, those fighters were needed in the East. The Eastern Front dictated German strategic priorities throughout the war. Soviet resilience also demonstrated the limits of German military power. The Wehrmacht, for all its vaunted skill and equipment, could not achieve victory against a determined opponent with sufficient resources. The racial ideology that drove Nazi policy toward the Soviet Union proved counterproductive. Hitler's vision of enslaving or exterminating the Slavic peoples meant that German forces couldn't count on support from local populations. In fact, German occupation policies were so brutal that they actually strengthened Soviet resistance. Partisan movements behind German lines disrupted supply lines, provided intelligence to Soviet forces, and tied down German troops who were needed at the front. The Soviet Union's ability to continue fighting despite catastrophic losses speaks to several factors. Stalin's totalitarian control meant he could demand sacrifices from the Soviet population that would have been impossible in a democracy. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, enforced discipline with brutal efficiency, executing soldiers who retreated without orders. Soviet propaganda successfully portrayed the war as a patriotic defense of Mother Russia rather than a defense of Stalin's regime. And Soviet industrial relocation, one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the war, meant that weapons production could continue even after losing vast territories in the West. The geographic depth of the Soviet Union also proved crucial. Unlike France, which Germany could conquer in 6 weeks, or Poland, which fell in a month, the Soviet Union stretched across 11 time zones. Every German advance meant longer supply lines, more territory to garrison, and diminishing returns. Napoleon had learned this lesson in 1812. Hitler should have, but didn't. The quality of Soviet military leadership also improved dramatically over the course of the war. Early commanders who failed were ruthlessly purged and replaced. Officers who showed competence and results, like Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky, were given increasing authority and responsibility. By 1944, Soviet commanders had mastered the art of large-scale offensive operations. Their operational planning, logistical preparation, and tactical execution matched or exceeded German capabilities. Soviet weapons production, despite losing much of the country's industrial capacity to German occupation, eventually exceeded German output. The Soviets concentrated on a few standardized designs that could be mass-produced: the T-34 tank, the Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, the Katyusha rocket launcher. These weren't always the most sophisticated weapons, but they were reliable, easy to produce, and available in quantities that overwhelmed German forces. The T-34 in particular revolutionized tank warfare with its combination of sloped armor, powerful gun, and excellent mobility. The Eastern Front also demonstrated the importance of adaptation and learning. The Red Army of 1941 was poorly led, poorly equipped, and poorly trained. The Red Army of 1944 was a formidable military machine capable of conducting sophisticated combined arms operations across vast distances. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It required ruthless self-assessment, willingness to learn from defeats, and systematic improvements in training, tactics, and organization. Perhaps most importantly, the Eastern Front demonstrated that the Nazi war machine was not invincible. Every German defeat, from Moscow to Stalingrad to Kursk to Bagration, chipped away at the myth of German military supremacy. It gave hope to occupied peoples across Europe. It encouraged resistance movements. It demonstrated to neutral nations that the Axis could be beaten. The psychological impact of German defeats in the East reverberated across every theater of the war. The price the Soviet Union paid for victory was horrific beyond comprehension. Entire cities were destroyed. Millions of civilians starved to death during the German occupation. The German retreat was characterized by deliberate destruction and atrocities. The scars of the war would mark Soviet society for generations. But the Soviet sacrifice was not in vain. It ground down the German military machine, destroyed the myth of German invincibility, and ultimately made Allied victory possible. When historians tally up the reasons why the Allies won World War II, the Eastern Front must rank near the top of any honest accounting. While Western histories often focus on D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe, the brutal truth is that the war was largely decided in the frozen fields outside Moscow, in the rubble of Stalingrad, in the tank battles around Kursk, and in the steppes of Ukraine. The Soviet Union didn't just contribute to Allied victory. Soviet resistance, Soviet casualties, and Soviet offensives were absolutely essential to defeating Nazi Germany. Without the Eastern Front, there is no Allied victory, or at least no Allied victory in 1945. Wars aren't won solely by soldiers on battlefields or tanks rolling across open ground. Sometimes the most decisive victories happen in quiet rooms where brilliant minds wrestle with seemingly incomprehensible jumbles of letters and numbers, searching for patterns, looking for weaknesses, trying to pierce the veil of enemy secrecy. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and crucial aspects of Allied victory: the triumph of intelligence, the breaking of codes that were thought to be unbreakable. Our story begins at an estate in the British countryside, about 50 miles northwest of London. Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion with 58 acres of grounds, became the site of the Government Code and Cipher School, the British organisation dedicated to breaking enemy codes. Today, Bletchley Park is famous, a museum and tourist attraction, celebrating the brilliant mathematicians and codebreakers who worked there. But during the war, Bletchley Park was one of Britain's most closely guarded secrets, its very existence known only to a handful of people at the highest levels of government. The story of Bletchley Park really begins with the Enigma machine, a device that looked something like a typewriter, but which could encode messages in ways that the Germans believed made them absolutely secure. The Enigma used a system of rotating wheels, electrical connections, and a plug board to scramble messages. The number of possible combinations was astronomical, measured in the billions of billions. German military commanders communicated with complete confidence that their messages were unreadable to Allied intelligence. But the Germans were wrong. Unknown to them, Polish mathematicians had begun working on Enigma before the war, achieving initial breakthroughs in understanding how the machine worked. In July 1939, just weeks before the German invasion of Poland, Polish intelligence shared their findings with British and French allies, including providing actual, Polish reconstructed Enigma machines. This Polish contribution cannot be overstated. Without the foundation laid by Polish codebreakers, the British efforts at Bletchley Park would have faced an almost impossible task. At Bletchley Park, a diverse group of talent assembled. Mathematicians from Cambridge and Oxford rubbed shoulders with chess champions, crossword puzzle experts, and linguists. Women made up about 75% of the workforce at Bletchley Park, performing crucial roles as analysts, machine operators, and administrators. The most famous of the Bletchley Park codebreakers was Alan Turing, a brilliant mathematician whose theoretical work would later help lay the foundations of modern computer science. Turing and his colleague Gordon Welchman developed a machine they called the bomb, which could rapidly test possible Enigma settings to find the correct ones for a given day's messages. The bomb wasn't a computer in the modern sense, but it was a sophisticated electromechanical device that could perform calculations far faster than any human could. By the end of the war, over 200 bombs were in operation, working around the clock to break German codes. The intelligence produced at Bletchley Park was given the code name Ultra for Top Secret Ultra. The success of Ultra was staggering. By May 1940, codebreakers had cracked the Enigma settings used by the German Air Force. Naval Enigma, used by German U-boats, proved more difficult but was eventually broken as well. This gave the Allies access to the innermost secrets of German military planning. The impact of Ultra on the war effort is difficult to overstate. In the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats threatened to starve Britain into submission by sinking merchant ships bringing supplies from America, Ultra intelligence allowed Allied convoys to route around wolf packs of submarines. When German U-boats were ordered to specific patrol areas, Ultra gave the Allies advance warning. Convoys could be diverted, escort forces positioned, and attacks planned. While the Battle of the Atlantic remained a close-run thing throughout 1942 and into 1943, Ultra intelligence was crucial to eventual Allied victory in this vital campaign. In North Africa, Ultra provided British commanders with detailed knowledge of Rommel's forces, his supply situation, and his operational intentions. British General Claude Auchinleck would later write that without Ultra, Rommel would certainly have reached Cairo. Allied forces weren't always able to exploit this intelligence effectively. Sometimes Rommel's tactical skill overcame Allied advantages. But over time, the ability to read German communications gave the Allies an edge that Rommel simply couldn't overcome. The value of Ultra extended to virtually every theatre of the war. Before D-Day, Ultra intelligence helped Allied commanders understand German defensive preparations in Normandy and confirmed that German forces remained convinced the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Throughout the campaign in Western Europe, Ultra gave Allied commanders insight into German deployments, reinforcements, and counter-attack plans. During the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, Ultra intelligence helped identify the build-up of German forces, though the intelligence was not properly assessed at the time. But here's the thing about Ultra. The Allies had to be incredibly careful about how they used this intelligence. If the Germans realized their codes were broken, they would change their procedures, possibly making Enigma unbreakable. So intelligence from Ultra could never be used in ways that would obviously reveal its source. Sometimes this meant accepting losses that might have been prevented if Ultra intelligence had been fully exploited. Convoys might still sail into danger if diverting them would have been too obvious. Attacks might be launched based on reconnaissance that was actually informed by code breaking. The cover story had to be maintained at all costs. This requirement for secrecy extended even after the war ended. For nearly 30 years after the war's conclusion, the ultra-secret remained classified. Veterans of Bletchley Park, bound by the Official Secrets Act, couldn't tell their own families what they had done during the war. It wasn't until 1974, when a former intelligence officer named Frederick Winterbotham published a book called The Ultra Secret, that the story began to emerge. Even Alan Turing, who would be driven to suicide in 1954 by persecution for his homosexuality, never received public recognition for his wartime achievements during his lifetime. Winston Churchill told King George VI that it was thanks to the secret weapon of intelligence that the war was won. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, described Ultra as decisive to Allied victory. Modern historians
have debated exactly how much Ultra shortened the war, with estimates ranging from several months to as much as 2 years. What's not debatable is that Ultra gave the Allies an enormous advantage, but Bletchley Park and Enigma weren't the only intelligence.
Triumph. Let's cross the Pacific to look at another crucial code-breaking success, the Battle of Midway. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor devastated the US Pacific Fleet, Japan appeared unstoppable. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and across the Pacific with stunning speed. But American codebreakers at Station Hypo, based in a basement at Pearl Harbor, had been working to crack Japanese naval codes. The main Japanese naval code was known as JN-25B to the Americans. By May 1942, Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had achieved sufficient success in breaking JN-25B to read parts of Japanese messages. Intelligence intercepts in May indicated that Japan was planning a major operation against a target designated only as AF. Rochefort and his team were convinced that AF meant Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategically important outpost in the Central Pacific. To confirm this suspicion, American intelligence devised a clever ruse. They instructed the American garrison at Midway to send a message in clear text reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Sure enough, Japanese intelligence intercepted this message, and Station Hypo soon decoded a Japanese message reporting that AF was having water problems. The trap had worked. AF was definitively identified as Midway. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, prepared an ambush. Despite being significantly outnumbered by the Japanese fleet, Nimitz positioned his 3 available aircraft carriers northeast of Midway, where they could strike the Japanese carriers as they approached the island. The resulting battle, fought on June 4, 1942, was a stunning American victory. All 4 Japanese fleet carriers involved in the attack were sunk, along with their experienced air crews. Japan lost the offensive capability it had wielded so effectively in the war's first months. The Battle of Midway has been called the most important naval battle of World War II, and many historians consider it the turning point of the Pacific War. Before Midway, Japan held the initiative. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. And this American victory was only possible because codebreakers had given American commanders advance warning of Japanese plans. Without that intelligence advantage, the American carriers might have been caught by surprise, possibly destroyed. The course of the Pacific War would have been very different. Japanese naval codes weren't the only ones that American codebreakers cracked. They also achieved significant success against Japanese army codes and diplomatic codes. When the Allies wanted to assassinate Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, in April 1943, they used decoded Japanese messages to pinpoint his flight schedule. American fighters intercepted and shot down Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville, killing one of Japan's most capable naval commanders. The intelligence war wasn't entirely one-sided. German codebreakers had some success against Allied codes, particularly early in the war. German B-Dienst managed to partially break British naval codes, which helped German U-boats target Allied convoys in the Atlantic. But German successes in code-breaking never reached the level of the Allied achievements, and as the war progressed, Allied communications security improved, while German communications remained vulnerable. Part of the Allied advantage in intelligence came from better security practices. The Americans, for example, used Navajo code talkers in the Pacific, Native American soldiers who transmitted messages in the Navajo language, which was unintelligible to Japanese listeners who had no knowledge of the language. The Navajo code was never broken. Similarly, Allied forces became increasingly disciplined about communication security, using one-time pads and other techniques for the most sensitive communications. The Germans' failure to realize their codes were compromised remains one of the most remarkable intelligence failures of the war. Despite occasional suspicions, despite statistical improbabilities in Allied success rates, despite interrogations of captured personnel, German leadership never fully grasped that Enigma had been broken. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, occasionally ordered reviews of Enigma security, but each time concluded that the system remained secure. This persistent German blindness was partly due to their own success in breaking some Allied codes, which led them to believe their own codes must be similarly secure. The intelligence advantage the Allies enjoyed wasn't just about raw information. It was about the ability to make better decisions. Commanders who know where the enemy is, what the enemy plans to do, and what resources the enemy has available can make much more effective plans than commanders operating in the fog of war. This advantage compounded over time. Successes built on intelligence allowed for more successes. Resources saved by avoiding ambushes could be applied elsewhere. Operations could be timed to maximum advantage. Intelligence also had important strategic implications beyond individual battles. Knowledge of German production capabilities, gained through both signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance, allowed Allied planners to target the most critical elements of the German war economy. Information about German reinforcements and troop movements informed decisions about where to attack and where to defend. Intelligence about German technological developments allowed the Allies to prioritize countermeasures. The psychological impact of intelligence superiority shouldn't be underestimated either. Allied commanders, knowing they had access to enemy communications, gained confidence in their planning. They could take calculated risks that would have been foolhardy without that information. Meanwhile, German and Japanese commanders, though they didn't realize it, were operating at a fundamental disadvantage. Their supposedly secure communications were actually transparent to their enemies. The technical and intellectual achievement represented by Allied code breaking was extraordinary. The people working at Bletchley Park and Station Hypo were facing problems that seemed almost impossible. The Enigma machine had been designed specifically to be unbreakable. The Japanese JN25 code used a complex two-stage encryption process. Breaking these codes required not just mathematical brilliance, but also persistence, intuition, and the ability to spot patterns in apparent randomness. The legacy of wartime code breaking extended far beyond World War II. The work done at Bletchley Park led directly to the development of early computers. The Colossus machine, developed to break the even more complex German Lorenz cipher used for high-level communications, was arguably the world's first programmable digital electronic computer. The theoretical work done by Turing and others laid foundations for computer science as a discipline. The organizational methods developed for managing intelligence analysis influenced post-war intelligence agencies. For the war itself, though, the impact was clear and decisive. Intelligence gave the Allies a significant advantage that the Axis never matched. It saved lives by preventing ambushes and failed operations. It saved resources by allowing more efficient use of limited assets. It shortened the war by enabling more effective military operations. When we tally up the reasons why the Allies won World War II, the triumph of intelligence deserves a prominent place on that list. The quiet heroes working in basement rooms and wooden huts contributed just as much to victory as the soldiers on the front lines, perhaps even more. They proved that in modern warfare, information can be as important as ammunition, and that the ability to read the enemy's mail might be the most valuable weapon of all. Picture vast formations of heavy bombers, hundreds of aircraft flying in tight formation, their contrails streaking across the sky like chalk marks on an enormous blue chalkboard. Below them, German cities and industrial facilities await destruction. This is strategic bombing, one of the most controversial and most crucial aspects of Allied victory in World War II. To understand why the Allies won, we need to understand what strategic bombing accomplished, and perhaps more importantly, what it cost. The theory behind strategic bombing was relatively straightforward. Modern industrial nations depend on factories, refineries, railways, and other infrastructure to wage war. If you can destroy enough of that infrastructure, you can cripple a nation's ability to fight without having to defeat its armies in the field. Before the war, some air power theorists believed that strategic bombing alone could win wars, that ground forces would become largely irrelevant. This prediction proved overly optimistic, to say the least. But strategic bombing did play a crucial role in Allied victory, particularly in the systematic destruction of German oil production. Britain's Royal Air Force began bombing German cities early in the war, initially focusing on industrial and military targets. However, the technology of the time made precision bombing at night essentially impossible. Navigational aids were primitive, bomb sites were inadequate. Weather over Europe was often terrible, with clouds obscuring targets. In practice, British bombers often struggled to even find the right city, much less hit specific factories within that city. The Butt Report of August 1941, which analysed photographs taken during bombing raids, concluded that only about 1 in 3 aircraft actually got within 5 miles of their intended target. Given these limitations, the RAF increasingly adopted area bombing, targeting entire cities rather than specific installations. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who took command of Bomber Command in February 1942, believed that destroying German cities would break civilian morale and cripple industrial production. The raids on Hamburg in July 1943, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, created a firestorm that killed an estimated 40,000 people. The February 1945 raid on Dresden remains controversial to this day, with estimates of civilian deaths ranging from 25,000 to as high as 135,000. The moral implications of area bombing are deeply troubling and have been debated by historians ever since. Deliberately targeting civilian populations represented a significant departure from previous conceptions of acceptable warfare. The line between legitimate military targets and terror bombing of civilians became increasingly blurred. These are serious ethical questions that deserve consideration. But from a purely military effectiveness standpoint, area bombing had mixed results. It certainly damaged German industrial production and forced Germany to divert resources to air defense and rebuilding. But it didn't break German civilian morale, and it didn't stop German war production entirely. The Americans, who began their strategic bombing campaign over Europe in 1942, took a different approach. American bombers, equipped with the supposedly more accurate Norden bomb sight and capable of defending themselves with heavy armament, conducted daylight precision bombing raids. The theory was that by attacking specific targets like ball-bearing factories or aircraft plants, they could create bottlenecks in German production more efficiently than area bombing could. Reality, as usual, proved more complicated. German fighter defenses inflicted horrific casualties on American bombers. During the raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories in October 1943, the Americans lost 60 bombers out of 290 that participated in the mission. That's a 20% loss rate, unsustainable over any length of time. Aircrews faced some of the highest casualty rates of any branch of the American military. A bomber crewman flying out of England had roughly a 1 in 4 chance of being killed and a 1 in 2 chance of being killed, wounded, or captured. The turning point in the strategic bombing campaign came with 2 related developments. First, the introduction of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, which could accompany bombers all the way to their targets and back. German fighters, which had been able to attack bomber formations with relative impunity, now faced American fighters that could match or exceed their performance. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force was being systematically destroyed in air-to-air combat. Experienced German pilots were being killed at a rate the training system couldn't replace. Second, Allied planners identified oil as a critical vulnerability in the German war economy. Germany had only limited access to natural oil fields and depended heavily on synthetic fuel plants that used coal as a feedstock to produce aviation gasoline and diesel fuel. In May 1944, the Allies launched a systematic campaign against German oil production. The results were devastating. Let's put some numbers on this because they're striking. In April 1944, before the oil campaign began, German synthetic fuel plants were producing 316,000 tons of fuel per month. Aviation gasoline production stood at 175,000 tons per month. By June, just 2 months into the campaign, overall fuel production had dropped to 107,000 tons, and aviation gasoline production had plummeted to 30,000 tons. That's a drop of more than 80% in aviation fuel in just 2 months. The impact cascaded through the German military machine. With fuel scarce, the Luftwaffe couldn't train new pilots properly. Flying hours for training pilots were cut drastically, meaning new pilots arrived at operational units with inadequate skills. This made them easy prey for experienced Allied pilots, further accelerating German losses. Ground operations were also affected. Panzer divisions that relied on tanks and other armored vehicles found themselves increasingly immobile. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive in the West, German forces counted on capturing Allied fuel supplies because they didn't have enough of their own. When this gamble failed, German tanks literally ran out of gas in the middle of the battlefield. The oil campaign also affected German production of other war materials. Synthetic rubber production, which depended on chemical processes similar to those used for synthetic fuel, dropped precipitously. Nitrogen production, essential for explosives, fell from 75,000 tons in early 1944 to 20,000 tons by year's end. These cascading effects meant that even German weapons that weren't destroyed could become unusable due to lack of fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. German attempts to defend against strategic bombing also imposed enormous costs. Germany deployed tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns, which required hundreds of thousands of soldiers to man them. These were soldiers and guns that couldn't be used on the front lines. Aluminum and other materials went into building these guns rather than into aircraft or tanks. At the peak of the strategic bombing campaign, Germany was devoting more resources to air defense than to any other single aspect of the war effort. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies over Europe in the war's early years, was forced into an increasingly defensive posture. German fighter production actually increased during 1944, reaching peaks that exceeded earlier production. But these new fighters were often flown by poorly trained pilots and increasingly lacked fuel. Many German aircraft sat uselessly on the ground, perfectly functional but unable to fly, because there was no fuel available. Strategic bombing also forced the dispersal of German industry. Facing continuous bombing of major industrial centers, Germany relocated factories to smaller sites, to underground facilities, to anywhere that might offer protection. This dispersal reduced efficiency and productivity. It interrupted production during the moves. It complicated supply chains and logistics. While it did provide some protection against bombing, the overall effect was to reduce German industrial output. The human cost of strategic bombing was immense. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 German civilians were killed by Allied bombing. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were left in ruins. Millions of people were made homeless. The moral burden of these civilian casualties falls on the Allied leadership who ordered these raids, and it's a burden that historians continue to grapple with. But from a cold, strategic perspective, the bombing campaign achieved significant results. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, estimated that bombing reduced potential German war production by 20 to 30%. In his memoirs, he identified the oil campaign in particular as decisive. He wrote that the attacks on synthetic fuel production in 1944 had the most direct effect on the course of the war. Without fuel, the German war machine simply couldn't function. The strategic bombing campaign also demonstrated the importance of air superiority. By mid-1944, the Allies completely dominated the skies over Europe. German forces moved by day at their peril, subject to attack by Allied fighters and bombers. Supply lines were disrupted, reinforcements were delayed, communications were compromised. This air superiority was essential to the success of D-Day and the subsequent campaign in northwest Europe. In the Pacific theater, strategic bombing played an even more direct role in ending the war. American B-29 super fortresses, flying from bases in the Mariana Islands, systematically destroyed Japanese cities with incendiary bombs. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people in a single night than either atomic bomb would later kill. Japanese industrial production, already constrained by blockade and lack of raw materials, essentially collapsed under this aerial onslaught. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were, in a sense, the ultimate expression of strategic bombing doctrine. These weapons, which killed somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 people, demonstrated that entire cities could now be destroyed by single aircraft. The psychological impact, combined with the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, convinced Japanese leaders to surrender, ending the war without the need for an invasion of the Japanese home islands that might have cost millions of additional lives. Strategic bombing represented a massive investment of resources by the Allies. Thousands of aircraft were built specifically for strategic bombing. Hundreds of thousands of men served in bomber crews or supported the bombing campaign. The casualties among bomber crews were staggering, particularly for the Americans and British flying missions over Germany. The United States Army Air Force suffered more than 26,000 killed flying bombing missions from Britain alone. Bomber Command of the RAF lost over 55,000 men killed, the highest casualty rate of any British service. Was this investment worth it? The answer depends partly on how you measure effectiveness. If you measure it purely in terms of destruction of the German war economy, the results were significant, but perhaps not decisive. Germany continued producing weapons right up until the end of the war. But if you measure it in terms of diversion of German resources, denial of fuel to German forces, disruption of communications and transport, and contribution to air superiority, then the strategic bombing campaign's value becomes much clearer. Historians continue to debate the effectiveness and morality of strategic bombing. Some argue that resources devoted to bombing would have been better used elsewhere. Others maintain that strategic bombing was essential to Allied victory. The truth, as usual, is complicated. Strategic bombing didn't win the war by itself, but it made winning the war easier. It complemented other aspects of Allied strategy. It forced Germany to fight a defensive battle on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the oil campaign in particular had a direct and devastating impact on German military effectiveness in the war's final year. When we consider the real reasons why the Allies defeated the Axis, strategic bombing must be included on that list, not because it was a war-winning weapon by itself, but because it represented one more significant advantage that the Allies possessed and the Axis couldn't match. Germany lacked the heavy bombers to conduct a similar campaign against Soviet industry relocated beyond the Urals. Japan attempted some strategic bombing against Chinese cities, but never had the capacity to threaten American production. The Allies, particularly the Americans and British, were able to take the war directly to the enemy homeland in a way the Axis never could. This asymmetry mattered. Combined with all the other advantages we've discussed, strategic bombing helped tip the balance decisively in the Allies' favor. The date June 6, 1944, is forever etched in the collective memory of the Western world. D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy, represents for many people the defining moment of World War II, at least in the Western theatre. Hollywood has given us vivid, visceral recreations of what those first hours on the beaches were like, the terror and chaos as men struggled through surf and across sand under withering German fire. But to understand why D-Day mattered, to understand its role in Allied victory, we need to look beyond the drama of the initial landing and examine what it accomplished strategically. By June of 1944, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically from the dark days of 1942. The Soviet Union had pushed German forces back across Eastern Europe. Allied bombing had begun to seriously damage the German war economy. American industrial production was in full swing, but Nazi Germany still occupied most of Europe. The Wehrmacht, though battered, remained a formidable fighting force. Hitler spoke of wonder weapons that would turn the tide. German propaganda promised that the Allies would be thrown back into the sea if they dared attempt an invasion. Victory was far from certain. Planning for the invasion had been underway for years. The original concept, developed by British planners, envisioned a landing on a relatively narrow front with 3 divisions. American General Dwight Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Allied Commander, and British General Bernard Montgomery, who would command ground forces for the initial phase, immediately recognized this plan as inadequate. They expanded it to 5 divisions landing on 5 separate beaches, with 3 airborne divisions dropped behind enemy lines to secure the flanks. This expansion meant delaying the invasion from May to June to accumulate sufficient landing craft, but it dramatically improved the chances of success. The Allies faced a daunting challenge. They needed to cross the English Channel, land substantial forces on a hostile Tahiti shore, establish a secure beachhead, and then break out into the French countryside before German reinforcements could contain them. The Germans, for their part, had spent years fortifying the French coast with what they called the Atlantic Wall, a system of bunkers, obstacles, minefields, and beach defenses designed to make any invasion impossible. But the Allies had several crucial advantages. First, and most importantly, they had achieved complete air superiority over the invasion area. The Luftwaffe, battered by months of combat against Allied fighters and bombers, could muster only a few hundred aircraft to oppose the invasion. Meanwhile, the Allies had more than 9,000 aircraft available. This air superiority meant that Allied forces could move and operate largely without fear of enemy air attack, while German forces faced constant threat from above. Second, the Allies had naval supremacy in the waters around Britain and France. The German Navy had been largely reduced to submarine operations, and even the U-boats faced increasingly effective Allied countermeasures. The invasion fleet, comprising over 5,000 ships and landing craft, crossed the Channel essentially unopposed by German naval forces. Third, the Allies had brilliant intelligence, both from ultra-decrypts and from an elaborate deception campaign called Operation Fortitude. This deception convinced the Germans that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point of the Channel, rather than Normandy. The Germans kept significant forces stationed at Pas-de-Calais even after the Normandy landings began, waiting for what they believed would be the real invasion. This deception was so successful that some German commanders believed the Normandy landing was merely a diversion for weeks after D-Day. Fourth, the Allies had solved many of the technical challenges of amphibious operations. Specialized landing craft could deliver tanks and vehicles directly onto beaches. Modified tanks, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies after their developer, could clear obstacles, lay bridges, or provide close fire support. The Allies planned to tow over massive artificial harbors called mulberries to provide port facilities, since capturing a functioning port quickly seemed unlikely. The weather almost derailed everything. Eisenhower had selected June 5th for the invasion, based on requirements for tide, moonlight, and time of day. But on June 4th, a storm in the Atlantic threatened to make conditions impossible. After agonizing over the decision, Consulting with meteorologists who predicted a brief window of acceptable weather, Eisenhower made the call. Okay, let's go. In the early hours of June 6th, Allied airborne forces began dropping into Normandy. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, many miles from their intended drop zones. British and Canadian airborne forces seized bridges and positions east of the invasion beaches. These airborne operations were chaotic and costly, but they achieved their objective of preventing German reinforcements from immediately counter-attacking the beaches. As dawn broke, the naval bombardment began. Thousands of guns from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded German defensive positions. Bombers added their weight to the bombardment. Then the first waves of landing craft headed for the beaches, designated Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Utah Beach, American forces landed slightly off course, but faced lighter resistance than expected. By the end of D-Day, they had achieved all their objectives with relatively light casualties. At Gold and Juno beaches, British and Canadian forces fought their way ashore against determined resistance. Specialized armor performed well, clearing obstacles and suppressing German positions. By day's end, British and Canadian forces had penetrated several miles inland. At Sword Beach, British forces pushed toward Caen, though they would not capture that city on D-Day as planned. But at Omaha Beach, everything went wrong. The preliminary bombardment largely missed German positions, which were stronger than intelligence had indicated. Rough seas swamped many of the specialized tanks that were supposed to provide fire support. The landing craft released troops too far from shore. German defenders, positioned in bunkers and positions overlooking the beach, had clear fields of fire. The first waves were cut down by machine gun and artillery fire. Bodies piled up at the water's edge. Officers and sergeants were killed trying to rally their men. For several hours, it appeared that the landing at Omaha might fail completely. But American forces, through sheer determination and individual acts of courage, eventually forced their way off the beach. Small groups of soldiers, often led by junior officers or NCOs, found ways to advance. Naval destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to provide direct fire support. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. By the end of the day, American forces held a precarious toehold on Omaha Beach, having suffered over 2,000 casualties. But they held it. By the end of D-Day, the Allies had landed over 150,000 troops in Normandy. They had secured all 5 beaches and established a continuous beachhead, though it was shallower than planned. Allied casualties for the day totaled roughly 10,000, including about 4,000 confirmed dead. This was heavy, but it was far lighter than some pre-invasion estimates, which had predicted casualties as high as 90% on some beaches. The German response to the invasion was confused and inadequate. Rommel, who had been given responsibility for defending the French coast, was in Germany visiting his wife on her birthday. Hitler, who had stayed up late the night before, was not awakened when the invasion began because his staff feared his wrath. When German commanders requested permission to move Panzer reserves toward Normandy, Hitler's headquarters delayed, still believing the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. By the time German armor finally moved toward the invasion beaches, Allied air power had already turned the roads of Normandy into killing zones. German reinforcements crawled forward, taking days to cover distances they could have traversed in hours if not for constant air attack. The weeks following D-Day saw some of the most intense fighting of the war. The bocage of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and sunken roads, favored the defender. German forces fought with skill and determination, making the Allies pay for every mile of advance. The battle for Caen became a grinding, attritional struggle. American forces fought their way across the Cotentin Peninsula to cut it off and capture the port of Cherbourg, only to find that German demolitions had so thoroughly wrecked the port that it would be months before it could be used. But the German position was ultimately untenable. They couldn't match Allied reinforcement rates. For every German soldier or tank that reached Normandy, several Allied soldiers and tanks landed. The Luftwaffe remained almost completely absent, while Allied aircraft dominated the battlefield. German supply lines were under constant attack, while Allied supply lines, though stretched, remained functional. The breakout from Normandy came at the end of July with Operation Cobra, an American offensive that finally punched through German lines. Once mobile warfare resumed, German forces found themselves unable to cope with the overwhelming Allied material superiority. By late August, German forces in Normandy had been largely destroyed in the Falaise pocket. Paris was liberated on August 25th. By September, Allied forces had reached the German border. The opening of the Western Front fundamentally changed the strategic situation. Germany now fought a true two-front war, with major Allied forces attacking from both east and west. Divisions that might have fought on the Eastern Front were instead tied down in France. Resources flowed to rebuild shattered Western armies. Hitler's attention divided between the two fronts. The Eastern Front continued to be the primary theatre where Germany's military power was ground down, but the Western Front's opening ensured that Germany had no hope of stabilizing even one front, let alone both. D-Day also demonstrated the maturity of Allied cooperation and planning. American, British, and Canadian forces operated under unified command. Logistics were coordinated across national boundaries. The operation required months of planning, training, and preparation, all conducted in remarkable secrecy despite involving hundreds of thousands of people. This level of inter-Allied cooperation was something the Axis never achieved. The invasion's success depended on all the factors we've discussed earlier. Industrial production provided the ships, landing craft, vehicles, and weapons needed. Intelligence gave the Allies knowledge of German deployments and allowed the deception campaign to succeed. Air superiority prevented German interference with the invasion fleet. Naval superiority allowed the safe crossing of the Channel. These factors combined with careful planning, specialized equipment, and the courage of the men who crossed those beaches to achieve a victory that would prove irreversible. D-Day wasn't the beginning of the end, despite the dramatic nature of the operation. The Soviet offensives on the Eastern Front, particularly Operation Bagration, launched just 3 weeks after D-Day, destroyed even more German divisions. But D-Day was a crucial turning point in the Western theatre. It ensured that Germany would face overwhelming force from multiple directions. It demonstrated Allied capability and resolve. It brought the war directly to Western Europe, and it set in motion the campaign that would end with Allied forces meeting Soviet forces in the heart of Germany. When we consider why the Allies won World War II, D-Day and the Normandy campaign deserve a prominent place in the answer, not because the beaches of Normandy were more important than the fields of Russia, but because they represented the culmination of years of Allied preparation, cooperation, and strategic planning. The invasion succeeded because of industrial might, air superiority, naval supremacy, intelligence success, technological innovation, and sheer determination. It succeeded because the Allies had learned from earlier failures and adapted. And it succeeded because, by June 1944, the balance of power had shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. D-Day didn't create that balance of power, but it demonstrated it decisively. Throughout this exploration of Allied strengths, we've seen how industrial capacity, intelligence superiority, effective strategy, and other factors contributed to Allied victory. But we'd be missing a crucial part of the story if we didn't examine the flip side of the coin. Axis failures, mistakes, and the fundamental weaknesses of their alliance. Wars are rarely won solely by one side's brilliance. They're often decided by the other side's errors, and the Axis powers made catastrophic mistakes, both individually and collectively. Let's start with perhaps the most fundamental Axis weakness, the complete lack of meaningful coordination between Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Tripartite Pact, signed in September 1940, theoretically united these three nations in a military alliance. In practice, it was barely worth the paper it was written on. Unlike the Allies, who held regular summit meetings where Roosevelt, Churchill, and later Stalin coordinated strategy, the Axis powers never held a single three-way meeting of their leaders. German and Japanese military staffs rarely shared information, let alone coordinated operations. Italy and Japan might as well have been fighting separate wars for all the cooperation between them. This lack of coordination led to strategic absurdities. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Germany was not informed in advance. Hitler learned about Pearl Harbor from radio broadcasts like everyone else. He then made the incomprehensible decision to declare war on the United States, despite having no treaty obligation to do so, and despite the fact that this brought America's massive industrial power into the war against Germany. This decision ranks among Hitler's greatest strategic blunders, turning what had been largely a European war into a truly global conflict where the material balance favored the Allies overwhelmingly. Similarly, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 proceeded without any meaningful coordination with Japan. If Germany and Japan had coordinated, Japan might have attacked the Soviet Union from the east, forcing Stalin to fight on two fronts and potentially collapsing Soviet resistance. But Japan, focused on its expansion in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, instead remained neutral toward the Soviet Union through most of the war. This allowed Stalin to transfer veteran Siberian divisions to the defense of Moscow at a crucial moment in late 1941. The contrast with Allied coordination is stark. When major strategic decisions were being made, Allied leaders consulted with each other. The Casablanca Conference in January 1943 saw Roosevelt and Churchill agree on a strategy of unconditional surrender and coordinate plans for operations in the Mediterranean. The Tehran Conference in November 1943 brought Stalin into direct negotiations with Roosevelt and Churchill, establishing the commitment to open a second front in France. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 determined the shape of post-war Europe and the Soviet agreement to enter the war against Japan. The Axis held no comparable conferences, made no comparable efforts at strategic coordination. This lack of coordination extended to military operations. German and Italian forces fought together in North Africa, but the relationship was fractious. Rommel, despite his brilliance, often found Italian forces unreliable and inadequately equipped. Italian military disasters in Greece and North Africa required German intervention, diverting forces that might have been used elsewhere. When the Allies invaded Sicily and then Italy itself, the Italian government quickly sought an armistice, leaving German forces to conduct a fighting retreat up the Italian peninsula without meaningful Italian support. The relationship between Germany and Japan was even more disconnected. These two nations occupied opposite sides of the planet and faced different enemies. They shared virtually no intelligence, coordinated no operations, and provided no material assistance to each other. When Germany needed raw materials that Japan could have supplied, no mechanisms existed for meaningful trade. When Japan needed technology that Germany possessed, transfer was sporadic and inadequate. A few German submarines reached Japan with cargo, and a few Japanese submarines reached Germany. But these were exceptions that proved the rule of non-cooperation. Now let's turn to German strategic decisions, because here we find a catalogue of errors that crippled the German war effort. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union while Britain remained undefeated meant fighting a two-front war, precisely the strategic nightmare that had doomed Germany in World War I. German planning for Operation Barbarossa assumed a quick victory before winter, despite Napoleon's experience demonstrating that Russia could not be conquered quickly. When that quick victory didn't materialize, Germany found itself committed to a grinding war of attrition against an opponent with superior manpower and resources.
Hitler's interference in operational decisions became increasingly destructive as the war progressed. Trained as an artist and politician, not a military officer, Hitler nevertheless insisted on making detailed military decisions that should have been left to professional commanders. His no-retreat orders prevented German forces from conducting tactical withdrawals that might have saved them from encirclement. At Stalingrad, Hitler's refusal to allow the Sixth Army to break out while it still could doomed that entire army to destruction or capture. Similar rigidity characterized his handling of other situations, turning defeats into catastrophes. Hitler's obsession with symbolic objectives over practical military goals repeatedly hurt German efforts. Stalingrad mattered partly because it bore Stalin's name, not because capturing it would actually have been strategically decisive. Resources devoted to besieging Leningrad for over 2 years might have been better used elsewhere. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of conquered territory meant German forces were spread thin across vast fronts, unable to concentrate sufficient force at decisive points. The Holocaust, Germany's campaign to exterminate European Jews, was not just a moral abomination, but also a strategic burden. The administrative machinery, military units, and transport resources devoted to genocide might have been used for military purposes. The brutality of German occupation policies, particularly in the Soviet Union, turned potential allies into enemies. Many Ukrainians and other Soviet minorities initially welcomed German forces as liberators from Stalin's tyranny. But German racial policies and brutal treatment soon convinced even anti-Soviet populations to resist German occupation. German production decisions also betrayed strategic incompetence. Despite facing an attritional war against opponents with superior industrial capacity, Germany didn't fully mobilize its economy for total war until 1943, by which time it was too late. German industry produced numerous different models of tanks, aircraft, and other weapons, each with unique parts and maintenance requirements. This complicated logistics and reduced overall production. In contrast, the Soviets and Americans focused on a few standardized designs that could be mass-produced efficiently. A German Tiger tank might be technically superior to an American Sherman, but if you can produce 5 Shermans for every Tiger, you win through weight of numbers. German technological development, while impressive in some areas, often pursued dead ends rather than practical weapons. The V-1 and V-2 rocket programs consumed enormous resources for weapons that had more psychological than military effect. Efforts to develop jet aircraft, while technologically impressive, came too late and consumed resources that might have been better spent on conventional fighters. German submarine development pursued increasingly sophisticated designs when simpler designs produced in larger quantities might have been more effective. Italy's performance as an Axis power was even worse. Mussolini harbored grandiose ambitions of recreating the Roman Empire, but Italy lacked the industrial capacity and military capability to back up those ambitions. Italian forces invaded Greece in October 1940 without adequate preparation, expecting an easy victory. Instead, Greek forces pushed the Italians back into Albania, forcing Germany to intervene to bail out its ally. This intervention delayed Operation Barbarossa, possibly by several crucial weeks, that would make the difference between capturing Moscow and being stopped short. Italian military equipment was often obsolete and inadequate. Italian tanks were undergunned and poorly armored. Italian aircraft couldn't match Allied or even German designs. Italian naval forces, while including some capable ships, lacked radar and other modern technology that gave Allied navies crucial advantages. Italian military leadership was often mediocre, and Italian soldiers, despite individual courage, were poorly led and inadequately supported. Italy's contribution to the Axis war effort was, at best, minimal and, at worst, actively harmful. Italian disasters in North Africa required German reinforcement. Italian incompetence in Greece triggered German intervention in the Balkans.
When Allied forces invaded Sicily and the Italian mainland, Italian resistance collapsed rapidly. Italy's armistice with the Allies in September 1943 meant that Germany had to garrison Italy and defend against Allied advances up the peninsula with no Italian assistance. Italy had gone from being a supposed ally to an occupied country requiring German military protection. Japan, the third major Axis power, also made strategic errors that contributed to Axis defeat. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor while achieving tactical surprise was a strategic disaster. It united American public opinion overnight, transforming the United States from an uncertain neutral to a fully committed enemy, bent on Japan's unconditional surrender. Japanese planners knew they couldn't win a prolonged war against American industrial might, but they attacked anyway, gambling that they could force a negotiated peace. This gamble failed completely. Japan's strategic objectives were contradictory and ultimately unachievable. They sought to establish a vast empire across Asia and the Pacific to secure raw materials and resources. But holding this empire required military forces and resources that Japan didn't possess. The more territory Japan conquered, the more forces were needed to garrison it. American strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily defended Japanese positions and seizing locations closer to Japan, meant that vast Japanese garrisons were left to wither on the vine, cut off and irrelevant. Japanese production could never match American output. As discussed earlier, American industry produced more aircraft in 3 months than Japan produced during the entire war. Every carrier sunk, every experienced pilot lost, represented an irreplaceable blow to Japanese military power. Meanwhile, American yards kept launching carriers, and American training programs kept producing pilots. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the Allies overwhelmingly. Japanese treatment of conquered peoples and prisoners of war created enemies where cooperation might have been possible. The brutality of Japanese occupation in China, Korea, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia ensured fierce resistance. The horrific treatment of Allied prisoners of war, exemplified by the Bataan Death March and the Burma Railway, hardened Allied resolve and eliminated any possibility of negotiated peace. Japan's racial ideology, which viewed other Asians as inferiors to be exploited and Westerners as decadent weaklings, blinded Japanese leadership to political opportunities and military realities. The cultural dimension of Japanese military thinking also contributed to strategic failure. The emphasis on offensive spirit and aggressive action while producing tactically skilled soldiers led to strategic rigidity. Japanese forces repeatedly launched attacks that had little chance of success but enormous cost in casualties. The kamikaze suicide attacks of the war's final year demonstrated desperate improvisation but achieved limited results at catastrophic cost. The refusal to surrender, even when defeat was inevitable, meant that Japanese forces fought to destruction rather than preserving strength for future operations. Perhaps most damning was the complete absence of Axis grand strategy. The Allies had a clear vision of what they were fighting for and what victory would look like. They agreed on unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. They coordinated operations to achieve complementary objectives. They divided responsibilities in ways that played to each nation's strengths. The Axis had no comparable strategic vision. Each nation pursued its own goals with little regard for how those goals fit into any larger picture. Germany wanted Lebensraum in the east and domination of Europe. Italy wanted to recreate the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. Japan wanted dominance over Asia and the Pacific. These goals weren't complementary. They were separate imperial projects that happened to be pursued simultaneously. The Tripartite Pact was a marriage of convenience, not a true alliance based on shared objectives and mutual support. This fundamental weakness meant that Axis powers couldn't support each other effectively. When Germany needed Japan to attack the Soviet Union, Japan focused on Southeast Asia. When Japan needed Germany to threaten British India, Germany was focused on Europe. When either needed raw materials or technology from the other, no effective mechanisms existed for transfer. The Axis was an alliance in name only, a paper tiger that looked impressive but lacked substance. The contrast with Allied cooperation becomes even starker when we consider things like the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which coordinated American and British military operations, or the Lend-Lease program, which allowed systematic sharing of resources. The Allies created institutional mechanisms for cooperation. The Axis never bothered, apparently assuming that parallel wars against common enemies would somehow achieve victory. Axis powers also failed to adapt effectively as the war progressed. Germany's military doctrine, so successful in 1939 and 40, became increasingly inadequate as the war dragged on. The Blitzkrieg approach worked wonderfully for quick victories against unprepared opponents, but it couldn't win wars of attrition against enemies with greater resources. Rather than adapting to this reality, Germany kept trying to achieve quick victories that were no longer possible. Japan similarly failed to adapt. Early victories in the Pacific relied on tactical surprise, superior training, and better equipment. Once these advantages eroded, Japan had no answer to American material superiority. Rather than developing a defensive strategy that might have prolonged the war and complicated Allied advance, Japan kept pursuing offensive operations. It lacked the resources to sustain. Italy never adapted because it never had a realistic strategy in the first place. Mussolini's dreams of empire bore no relationship to Italy's actual capabilities. When faced with the reality that Italy couldn't match Allied military power, Italian leadership simply collapsed. The personal relationships between Axis leaders also contributed to strategic failure. Hitler and Mussolini had a sort of friendship, but it was based more on mutual admiration than effective military cooperation. Hitler privately despised Italian military performance, but couldn't openly acknowledge this without undermining the alliance. Mussolini resented German condescension, but depended on German military support. This dynamic produced an alliance where neither partner could be honest with the other. Hitler and the Japanese leadership barely knew each other and communicated mainly through formal diplomatic channels. There was no trust, no personal connection, no foundation for the kind of intimate, strategic cooperation that characterized Allied leadership. Churchill and Roosevelt developed a genuine working relationship through regular meetings and correspondence. Stalin, while maintaining distance, participated in conferences where real decisions were made. Axis leaders made decisions in isolation and hoped their partners would somehow complement those decisions. The Axis also suffered from ideological contradictions that the Allies didn't face. German racial ideology viewed Japanese as racial inferiors, Asians who shouldn't be on the same level as Germans. Japanese ideology viewed Germans as Western powers who might be useful temporarily, but were fundamentally different from and potentially threatening to Japan's Asian sphere. Italian fascism, while authoritarian, lacked the rigid racial hierarchy of Nazism and was somewhat incompatible with German worldview. These ideological differences prevented genuine cooperation and ensured that the alliance remained superficial. Military cultures also clashed in ways that hindered cooperation. German military tradition emphasized staff work, careful planning, and operational flexibility. Italian military tradition, at least under Mussolini, emphasized aggressive rhetoric over careful preparation. Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual factors and warrior ethos over material calculations. These different approaches to warfare made coordination difficult even when attempted. The Axis also suffered from a fundamental imbalance in capabilities. Germany was far stronger than Italy, which created a patron-client relationship rather than a partnership of equals. Japan operated in a completely different geographic theater, making material cooperation nearly impossible. Unlike the Allied coalition, where America, Britain, and the Soviet Union Were all major powers capable of significant contributions, the Axis had one dominant power, Germany, supporting a weak ally, Italy, while pursuing parallel goals with a distant partner, Japan. This imbalance meant that Germany bore most of the burden of Axis war efforts in Europe, while receiving minimal support from Italy and none from Japan. Germany had to bail out Italy repeatedly while fighting the Soviet Union, defending against Allied bombing and eventually defending against Allied invasions from the south and west. No nation, regardless of military skill or industrial capacity, could win under those conditions. Axis intelligence failures also deserve mention. We've discussed Allied intelligence successes, but Axis intelligence was consistently poor. German intelligence about Soviet military strength and production capacity was wildly inaccurate, contributing to the disastrous decision to invade. German intelligence about Allied intentions for D-Day was completely fooled by Operation Fortitude. Japanese intelligence failed to detect American preparations for Midway and failed to accurately assess American industrial capacity. These intelligence failures meant Axis leaders made decisions based on faulty information, compounding their other strategic errors. The inability to coordinate intelligence made things even worse. German and Japanese intelligence agencies rarely shared information. When German agents learned something useful about Soviet or American capabilities, that information didn't reach Japanese planners, and vice versa. This contrasts sharply with Allied intelligence cooperation, where British and American intelligence agencies worked closely together and even shared some information with the Soviets. Looking at Axis failures and weaknesses helps complete the picture of why the Allies won. It wasn't just that the Allies did things right, though they often did. It was also that the Axis did things wrong, consistently and catastrophically. Strategic incoherence, operational interference, production inefficiencies, brutal occupation policies, intelligence failures, and complete lack of meaningful cooperation all contributed to Axis defeat. When we consider counterfactual scenarios, better Axis coordination might have complicated Allied victory significantly. If Japan had attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin might not have survived. If Germany had focused exclusively on either Britain or the Soviet Union, rather than fighting both simultaneously, outcomes might have been different. If the Axis had actually cooperated on intelligence, production, and strategy, they would have been far more dangerous. But these counterfactuals require imagining an Axis that was fundamentally different from what it actually was. The alliance's weaknesses weren't accidents or bad luck. They were inherent to the nature of the regimes involved. Totalitarian dictatorships, each led by a leader with absolute power and surrounded by sycophants, don't cooperate well with each other. Ideologies based on racial hierarchy and national supremacy don't lend themselves to genuine partnership. Military strategies based on quick victories and brutal subjugation don't adapt well to prolonged conflicts. The Axis lost not just because the Allies were strong, but because the Axis was weak, and much of that weakness was self-inflicted, the inevitable result of the kind of regimes they were and the kind of war they chose to fight. Beyond strategy, leadership, and intelligence, World War II came down to some fundamental material factors that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Wars of the scale and intensity of the Second World War ultimately become contests of resources and endurance. Let's examine how access to resources, geographic advantages, and the sheer mathematics of attrition all favored the Allied cause. Start with the most basic resource: oil. Modern mechanized warfare runs on oil. Tanks need fuel. Aircraft need fuel. Ships need fuel. Trucks need fuel. Without oil, the most powerful military force becomes immobile, useless metal sitting by the roadside. The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, suffered from chronic oil shortages throughout the war. Germany's limited domestic oil production meant reliance on synthetic fuel plants and the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești. When Allied bombing targeted synthetic fuel production in 1944, German military operations ground to a halt for lack of fuel. Japan's entire expansion into Southeast Asia was driven largely by the need to secure oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. When American submarines cut Japanese tanker routes, the Japanese war economy suffocated. The Allies, by contrast, had abundant oil. American oil fields produced more than enough to supply Allied forces worldwide. British control of Middle Eastern oil fields added to this abundance. The Soviet Union had its own oil fields in the Caucasus and Central Asia. While local shortages occasionally occurred, the Allies never faced the kind of systematic fuel crisis that crippled Axis forces. Iron ore, coal, and other raw materials followed similar patterns. The Soviet Union, despite losing significant industrial regions to German occupation, retained access to vast mineral resources in the Urals and beyond. America's resource base was essentially inexhaustible. Britain, through its empire and trade relationships, could access resources from around the world. The Axis, by contrast, became increasingly resource-starved as the war progressed. German access to Swedish iron ore was threatened by Norwegian resistance and Allied pressure. Japanese control of resource-rich territories in Asia proved illusory as American submarines and aircraft interdicted shipments back to Japan. Food was another critical resource where the Allies held overwhelming advantages. America's agricultural productivity was legendary, producing surpluses that fed not just American forces, but Allied civilians and soldiers worldwide through Lend-Lease. Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth nations added to Allied food supplies. The Soviet Union, despite suffering catastrophic agricultural losses to German occupation and the siege of Leningrad, managed to keep its armies fed, partly through Lend-Lease supplies and partly through heroic agricultural mobilization in unoccupied areas. Axis food supplies, meanwhile, were chronically inadequate. Germany had to extract food from occupied territories to feed its population and armies, contributing to starvation and resentment among occupied peoples. Japan's food situation grew increasingly desperate as the war progressed, with mainland Japan facing serious shortages by 1945. Italy, never food self-sufficient, depended on imports that Allied naval power increasingly interdicted. Geography played an enormous role in determining resource access. The United States sat protected by two vast oceans, its agricultural and industrial heartland completely secure from enemy attack. No German or Japanese bomber could reach American factories. No Axis soldier would set foot on American soil except as a prisoner. This geographic security allowed America to devote essentially its entire productive capacity to the war effort without having to divert resources to homeland defense or reconstruction. Britain, as an island nation, was more vulnerable, but still possessed significant geographic advantages. The English Channel, though narrow, represented a formidable barrier to invasion that the Germans never seriously attempted to cross after the Battle of Britain. The Royal Navy's command of home waters meant that Britain could import resources from across the globe and ship armies to any theatre. British cities suffered from German bombing, but British industry remained largely intact and productive. The Soviet Union's geography worked both for and against it. The catastrophic losses of 1941 showed the vulnerability of Western Soviet territories, but the sheer vastness of the Soviet Union ultimately proved decisive. German armies advanced hundreds of miles and still hadn't conquered the Soviet Union. Soviet industry relocated beyond the Urals, continued production beyond German reach. The geographic depth that Napoleon had learned to respect in 1812 proved equally valuable against Hitler. Axis geography, conversely, was problematic. Germany sat in the heart of Europe, surrounded by enemies or potential enemies. Once the Allies achieved air superiority, Germany itself became a target for strategic bombing. Japan's island geography made it dependent on shipping that became increasingly vulnerable to American submarines. Italy's peninsular geography made it vulnerable to amphibious invasion, as the Allies demonstrated in Sicily and Salerno. The mathematics of attrition starkly favored the Allies. Let's consider population. The Soviet Union had a population of over 190 million. The United States had over 130 million. The British Empire, including India, numbered in the hundreds of millions. China, though weakly governed, had 450 million people. Even accounting for territories under Axis control, the Allies could draw on vastly larger populations than the Axis. Germany had a population of about 80 million, Japan about 73 million, Italy about 44 million. The German-occupied territories added to this, but occupation proved costly, requiring garrison forces and generating resistance that tied down additional troops. The demographic balance overwhelmingly favored the Allies, which meant the Allies could replace losses while Axis manpower became increasingly stretched. This demographic advantage translated directly to military manpower. The Soviet Union mobilized over 34 million people into its armed forces over the course of the war. America mobilized over 16 million. Britain mobilized over 5 million. These numbers dwarfed Axis mobilization. Germany mobilized about 18 million over the entire war, but never had more than about 9 million under arms at any one time. Japan mobilized about 9 million total. Italy's mobilization was even smaller and largely ineffective. The economic comparison is equally lopsided. At its peak in 1941, Axis GDP totaled about $911 billion in constant international dollars. Allied GDP at the same time was $1,798 billion, nearly double. American GDP alone exceeded total Axis GDP. This economic disparity meant the Allies could produce more of everything. More weapons, more ammunition, more supplies, more everything needed to sustain modern warfare. Consider aircraft production numbers again, because they illustrate the scale of Allied advantages. From 1939 to 1945, the United States produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Britain produced over 131,000. The Soviet Union produced over 157,000. That's nearly 600,000 Allied aircraft. Germany produced about 119,000 aircraft. Japan produced about 76,000. Italy produced about 11,000. Total Axis production was about 206,000, barely one-third of Allied production. Tank production shows similar ratios. The Soviets alone produced over 107,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. America produced over 88,000. Britain produced about 27,000. Total Allied tank production exceeded 222,000. Germany produced about 67,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Japan produced about 6,000. Italy produced about 3,500. Total Axis tank production was under 77,000, barely one-third of Allied production. These production ratios meant that even with superior tactical skill and better individual weapons, Axis forces faced overwhelming material disadvantages. A German tank crew that destroyed 3 Allied tanks before being destroyed themselves was still losing the exchange, because the Allies could replace those 3 tanks and the Germans often couldn't replace theirs. The naval comparison is perhaps most stark. American shipyards launched dozens of fleet carriers and hundreds of escort carriers. American submarine construction program produced hundreds of submarines that strangled Japanese shipping. American production of destroyers, destroyer escorts, and other anti-submarine vessels turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. British and Canadian shipyards added to this production. Meanwhile, German submarine construction, though impressive, could never match the rate at which Allied shipyards produced anti-submarine vessels. Japanese carrier losses could never be made good, while American carriers kept arriving in increasing numbers. Logistics and transportation capabilities also heavily favored the Allies. American production of trucks gave Allied forces mobility that Axis forces lacked. The Red Army's ability to conduct massive offensive operations depended heavily on American trucks provided through Lend-Lease. Allied control of the seas meant supplies could be transported globally. The Allied logistics tail, though often criticized as excessive, meant Allied forces rarely lacked for ammunition, fuel, food, or medical supplies. Axis logistics, by contrast, was perpetually inadequate. German armies advanced beyond their supply capabilities in Russia. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific operated on shoestring logistics, sometimes literally starving. Italian forces in North Africa were chronically undersupplied. This logistical inadequacy meant that even when Axis forces achieved tactical victories, they often couldn't exploit them because they lacked the supplies needed to continue operations. The human capital comparison also favored the Allies. Allied educational systems produced more trained engineers, scientists, technicians, and skilled workers. American and British universities generated research that contributed to weapons development and production efficiency. The Soviet system, despite its many flaws, emphasized technical education that fed industrial production. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, drew on an enormous pool of scientific talent that the Axis couldn't match. Axis technical education, while excellent in some areas, was more limited in scale. Germany produced brilliant scientists and engineers, but in smaller numbers than the Allies. Japan's technical education emphasized practical engineering, but lacked the theoretical depth of Western science in some areas. Italy's technical capabilities, while respectable, couldn't match those of the major powers. Medical capabilities also mattered. Allied medicine, particularly American medicine with its abundance of sulfur drugs and later penicillin, could treat wounds and diseases more effectively than Axis medicine. This meant Allied wounded returned to duty more often and more quickly. It meant Allied forces suffered less from disease. These might seem like minor factors, but they accumulated. Over the course of a long war, better medical care translated to more effective soldiers. The combination of all these material factors created a situation where Axis defeat was nearly inevitable once the war became protracted. If the war had ended in 1940, with German domination of Western Europe and Japanese domination of East Asia, the Axis might have won, in some sense. But once Britain refused to surrender, once the Soviet Union survived the initial German onslaught, once America entered the war, the mathematics of attrition began working inexorably against the Axis. Every month that passed saw Allied production increase, while Axis production stagnated or declined. Every month saw Allied forces grow stronger, while Axis forces were ground down. By 1944, the material balance had become so one-sided that Axis defeat was simply a matter of time. Individual battles might be won or lost based on tactics, leadership, or luck, but the overall trajectory was fixed. This doesn't mean Allied victory was easy or inevitable from the start. It required years of sacrifice, millions of casualties, and enormous effort. But once the resource mobilization race began in earnest, the outcome was foreordained by factors beyond any leader's control. The Axis simply didn't have access to the resources needed to win a protracted global conflict against enemies with overwhelming advantages in population, production, and resources. When we ask why the Allies won World War II, part of the answer is simply, they had more of everything that mattered. More people, more factories, more oil, more food, more steel, more trucks, more everything. And in a war of the scale and intensity of World War II, where the industrial age had made war a contest of production as much as courage, having more mattered enormously. Wars are fought by soldiers, but they're directed by leaders.
The quality of political and military leadership, the ability to learn from mistakes, the willingness to adapt to changing circumstances, these factors can amplify or squander material advantages. As we near the end of our exploration of why the Allies won World War II, we need to examine the human dimension of leadership and decision-making. The Allied coalition benefited from remarkable political leadership, despite the very different backgrounds and ideologies of its principal leaders. Franklin Roosevelt brought political skill, strategic vision, and the ability to manage America's complex democracy while prosecuting a global war. His fireside chats kept American morale high. His relationship with Congress, though sometimes rocky, ensured continued support for the war effort. His vision of a post-war international order embodied in the United Nations gave the war a purpose beyond mere victory. Winston Churchill's leadership during Britain's darkest hour provided inspiration when inspiration was desperately needed. His speeches rallied British spirits when invasion seemed imminent. His strategic sense, while not always correct, kept Britain in the fight and shaped Allied strategy. His relationship with Roosevelt, conducted through frequent correspondence and meetings, created the foundation for Allied cooperation. Churchill understood that Britain couldn't win alone and worked tirelessly to bring America
fully into the war. Joseph Stalin's leadership was brutal, ruthless, and brought victory at catastrophic cost. But it was also effective in ways that softer leadership might not have been. Stalin's willingness to accept enormous casualties kept Soviet armies attacking, even when Western democracies might have paused. His totalitarian control allowed rapid industrial mobilization and relocation. His purges had crippled the Red Army in the late 1930s. But once the war began, Stalin proved capable of learning from disasters and empowering capable commanders. The relationship between these three leaders, despite deep ideological differences and mutual suspicions, proved functional. They could disagree sharply about strategy. Churchill favored operations in the Mediterranean, while Stalin demanded a second front in France. But they could also compromise and coordinate. The regular conferences at Casablanca, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam demonstrated a level of Allied cooperation that the Axis never achieved. Compare this to Axis leadership. Hitler's increasing operational interference has already been discussed, but his broader leadership failures deserve emphasis. He surrounded himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. He made major strategic decisions based on intuition or ideology rather than military logic. His refusal to accept reality, insisting forces hold untenable positions, believing in wonder weapons that would somehow win the war, maintaining faith in victory even as Allied armies closed in on Berlin, prevented rational strategic adaptation. Mussolini's leadership was equally poor. He led Italy into a war it wasn't prepared to fight, driven by vanity and visions of imperial glory rather than realistic assessment of Italian capabilities. When Italian forces repeatedly failed, Mussolini blamed subordinates rather than acknowledging fundamental problems. His overthrow in July 1943, when even Italian fascists recognized the hopelessness of continuing the war, demonstrated how completely he had lost touch with reality. Japanese leadership was divided between civilian government and military factions that operated almost independently. The emperor, while theoretically supreme, exercised limited practical authority. Decision-making was often paralyzed by factional disputes. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor, which unified American opinion against Japan, reflected this dysfunctional leadership. Japanese leaders knew they couldn't win a protracted war against America, but they attacked anyway, hoping somehow circumstances would change in their favor. Allied military leadership, while not perfect, generally proved more effective than Axis military leadership. Generals like Eisenhower, Montgomery, Zhukov, and MacArthur made mistakes, sometimes serious ones, but they also demonstrated the ability to learn and adapt. Eisenhower's genius lay less in tactical brilliance than in his ability to manage a Coalition of prickly subordinates and coordinate complex operations. Montgomery, despite his personal flaws, understood that patient preparation and overwhelming material superiority could minimize casualties. Zhukov combined ruthless determination with genuine operational skill. These leaders benefited from systems that allowed honest feedback and encouraged adaptation. American military doctrine emphasized learning from experience. After-action reports analyzed what went right and wrong in each operation. Lessons learned from North Africa informed planning for Sicily. Experience in Sicily influenced preparations for Normandy. This systematic learning process meant Allied forces became progressively more effective as the war continued. The contrast with German military leadership is instructive. German generals were often tactically brilliant, conducting operations that Western military academies still study. But they operated within a system where Hitler's authority was absolute and where suggesting retreat or restraint could be career-ending or worse. Many capable German generals were fired for advocating sensible operational decisions that Hitler rejected for ideological reasons. This created a system where even brilliant commanders were hamstrung by political interference. Soviet military leadership improved dramatically over the course of the war. The purges of 1937 and 38 had gutted the Red Army's officer corps, leaving it led by politically reliable but often militarily incompetent commanders. The disasters of 1941 forced brutal Darwinian selection. Commanders who failed were shot or demoted. Commanders who showed competence, like Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky, were promoted and given increasing responsibility. By 1944, Soviet operational art was sophisticated and effective, easily matching German capabilities. Allied willingness to replace failed commanders also proved important. When American General Lloyd Fredendall performed poorly in North Africa, he was relieved. When British General Auchinleck couldn't defeat Rommel, he was replaced by Montgomery. This might seem obvious, but it represented a meritocratic approach that some systems struggled with. The Allies created systems where performance mattered more than connections or ideology. Technological adaptation provides another measure of leadership effectiveness. When American torpedoes proved defective early in the Pacific War, submarine commanders complained, investigations were conducted, and the problems were fixed. When Allied tanks proved inferior to German armor, efforts were made to develop better tanks, though production priorities meant Shermans continued to dominate. When German U-boats threatened to win the Battle of the Atlantic, the Allies adapted tactics, developed better anti-submarine technology, and eventually mastered the threat. The Axis struggled more with adaptation. Japanese naval aviation, supreme in 1941, never adapted to losses of experienced pilots and increasingly capable American opposition. German tank development pursued ever heavier and more complex designs when simpler, more producible designs might have been more effective. Italy barely adapted at all, maintaining the same inadequate equipment and doctrine throughout. Allied air doctrine evolved significantly during the war. Early British bombers attempted precision night bombing, found it impossible, and shifted to area bombing. American daylight bombing initially suffered catastrophic losses, then adapted by introducing long-range escort fighters. Strategic bombing targeting shifted from area attacks to focused campaigns against oil production when analysis showed oil to be a critical vulnerability. This flexibility in doctrine and targeting represented organizational learning at a high level. Inter-service cooperation also improved over time. The American military initially struggled with Army-Navy rivalry that complicated operations. By mid-war, genuine cooperation had developed, with amphibious operations in the Pacific demonstrating sophisticated coordination. British services similarly learned to cooperate effectively. Combined operations like D-Day required Army, Navy, and Air Force to work together seamlessly, something that would have been impossible earlier in the war. The Allies also proved better at coalition warfare, integrating American, British,
Canadian, and other forces under unified command structures required compromising national pride and overcoming different military cultures. The combined chiefs of staff created mechanisms for coordinating American and British strategy. Soviet forces, while more independent, still coordinated major operations with Western offensives. This cooperation wasn't always smooth, but it functioned adequately. Compare this to Axis coalition warfare, which barely existed. German and Italian forces operated together only because Italian incompetence forced German intervention. German and Japanese forces never cooperated meaningfully. The Axis lacked any institutional mechanisms for coordinating strategy or operations. Each member fought essentially separate wars that happened to be against common enemies. Allied intelligence services learned to cooperate effectively, as we've discussed with Bletchley Park and American code breaking. Allied logistics organizations coordinated supplies across multiple theaters. Allied industrial production was coordinated to avoid duplication and ensure resources went where most needed. These weren't perfect systems, but they represented genuine efforts at cooperation that far exceeded anything the Axis achieved. The ability to maintain morale, both military and civilian, also reflected leadership quality. Allied propaganda emphasized genuine war aims, defeating fascism, liberating occupied peoples, creating a better post-war world. These weren't always honest or consistent
messages, but they resonated more effectively than Axis propaganda. German propaganda increasingly emphasized defense against Asiatic hordes and Jewish Bolshevism, fear-based messaging that lost effectiveness as German defeat became obvious. Japanese propaganda emphasized racial superiority and divine destiny, messages that rang increasingly hollow as American forces advanced. Allied leaders also made difficult decisions that Axis leaders avoided. The decision to demand unconditional surrender, announced at Casablanca in January 1943, eliminated any possibility of negotiated peace and ensured the Allies would fight to complete victory. This decision is sometimes criticized as prolonging the war by eliminating any incentive for Axis powers to surrender early. But it also ensured Allied unity and prevented the kind of armistice that had followed World War I, leaving grievances that fueled another conflict. The decision to develop and use the atomic bomb represented another consequential choice. Roosevelt authorized the Manhattan Project, which cost $2 billion and employed hundreds of thousands of people, on the possibility it might prove decisive. Truman's decision to actually use the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war, but at enormous moral cost. Whatever one thinks of these decisions, they represented leadership willing to make hard choices and see them through. Allied leaders also demonstrated the ability to look beyond immediate military necessity to post-war planning. The Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944 established the post-war international economic order while war still raged. Planning for occupied Germany and Japan began well before those countries were defeated. The United Nations Charter was drafted while fighting continued. This forward thinking ensured that victory wouldn't simply create a power vacuum leading to future conflict. The quality of political and military leadership doesn't always determine outcomes. Material factors matter enormously, as we've discussed. But leadership can multiply advantages or squander them. Allied leadership, while far from perfect, proved generally more capable, more adaptable, and more effective than Axis leadership. This leadership advantage, combined with material superiority, intelligence success, and all the other factors we've examined, contributed significantly to Allied victory. We've now examined the major factors contributing to Allied victory: industrial production, Lend-Lease, Soviet resilience on the Eastern Front, intelligence superiority, strategic bombing, D-Day and the Western Front, Axis failures, resource advantages, and leadership quality. But the real story isn't about any single factor. It's about how all these elements interlocked, reinforced each other, and created a synergy that made Allied victory not just possible, but ultimately inevitable once the war became protracted. Consider how industrial production enabled everything else. Without American production capacity, there would have been no Lend-Lease to sustain Britain and the Soviet Union. Without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union might not have survived 1941 and 42. Without Soviet survival, Germany would have dominated Europe and concentrated its full strength against any Western invasion. Without overwhelming material superiority, D-Day might have failed. Each factor depended on others. Intelligence superiority exemplifies this interconnection. Ultra-intelligence helped win the Battle of the Atlantic by allowing convoys to avoid U-boat wolf packs. Winning the Battle of the Atlantic ensured continued American supply of Britain. Those supplies enabled Britain to build up forces for eventual liberation of Europe. Ultra-intelligence about German dispositions in Normandy helped D-Day succeed. D-Day's success depended on air superiority, which depended on strategic bombing's destruction of the Luftwaffe, which depended on intelligence about German aircraft production and bases. Everything connected. Strategic bombing demonstrates similar interconnections. Bombing campaign success depended on achieving air superiority. Air superiority depended on American fighter production, particularly the P-51 Mustang. Fighter production depended on American industrial capacity and raw materials. Identifying targets for bombing required intelligence about German industry and infrastructure. The oil campaign's effectiveness depended on intelligence, production capacity, and operational capability all working together. The Eastern Front's decisive importance depended on factors we might easily overlook. Soviet resistance required enormous manpower, which Soviet demographic advantage provided. It required weapons production, which Soviet industry relocated beyond the Urals supplied. It required transportation, which Lend-Lease trucks enabled. It required food and fuel, which Lend-Lease and Soviet resources provided. It required intelligence about German plans, which Soviet intelligence and Lucy Spyring supplied. It required operational skill, which Soviet commanders developed through painful learning. None of these factors alone sufficed. All were necessary. D-Day's success similarly depended on multiple interlocking factors. Naval supremacy ensured safe crossing of the Channel. Air superiority prevented Luftwaffe interference. Intelligence enabled deception operations. Industrial production provided landing craft, specialized equipment, and enormous stockpiles of supplies. Allied cooperation ensured unified command and coordinated operations. Training and experience from operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy informed planning. The strategic situation, with Germany fighting on multiple fronts, prevented concentration of German forces against the landing. Remove any of these factors and D-Day becomes far more difficult, perhaps impossible. The cumulative effect of these interlocking advantages created a situation where the Allies held almost every card that mattered. They had more people, more resources, more production, better intelligence, better leadership, better cooperation, and better adaptability. The Axis held some temporary advantages in tactics, equipment quality in some areas, and fighting spirit. But these advantages couldn't overcome the fundamental asymmetries in capability and coordination. Let's consider some counterfactual scenarios to illustrate how these factors interlocked. Suppose America's industrial capacity had been half what it actually was. Could the Allies still have won? Probably, but it would have taken much longer and cost far more casualties. Lend-Lease would have been severely constrained, possibly allowing German victory in Russia. American forces would have been much smaller and less well equipped. D-Day might have been delayed into 1945 or later. The war might have dragged on for additional years. Now suppose the Allies hadn't broken Enigma and other Axis codes. Could they still have won? Again, probably, but at far greater cost. The Battle of the Atlantic would have been even more costly and might have taken longer to win. D-Day planning would have been far more uncertain. Operations like Midway that depended on intelligence might have had different outcomes. Intelligence wasn't absolutely decisive, but it made victory faster and less costly. What if the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1941? This is the most frightening counterfactual for the Allies. With no eastern front to occupy German forces, the Wehrmacht could have concentrated overwhelming force in the west. D-Day against this concentrated German army might have been impossible. Britain might have faced renewed invasion threat. The war would have been immensely more difficult and uncertain for the Western Allies. What if Hitler hadn't declared war on America after Pearl Harbor? Japan and America would still have fought in the Pacific, but Germany and America might not have fought in Europe. Without American involvement, would Britain and the Soviet Union have defeated Germany? Possibly, but it would have been a much closer thing. Soviet victory would have come at even more catastrophic cost. Post-war Europe would have been dominated by the Soviet Union, without American counterweight. These counterfactuals illustrate that while no single factor was absolutely decisive, several factors were crucial. Soviet survival was perhaps most crucial for eventual Allied victory in Europe. American industrial capacity was crucial for providing the material basis of that victory. Allied cooperation and coordination were crucial for translating material advantages into military success. The interlocking nature of these factors also explains why Axis defeat, while not inevitable from the start, became inevitable once certain conditions were established. Once Britain survived 1940 and refused to make peace. Once the Soviet Union survived 1941, once America entered the war, the combination of these three major powers created a coalition with overwhelming advantages. The Axis had a window of opportunity for decisive victory, perhaps from 1939 to mid-1941. Once that window closed, mathematics of attrition began working against them. This doesn't minimize the courage and sacrifice required for victory. Millions of people died, cities were destroyed, entire societies were devastated. Victory was bought at terrible cost. But the outcome, once certain conditions were established, was determined by factors beyond any individual's control. The Allies had the industrial capacity, the resources, the population, the technology, and the coordination to win a protracted global conflict. The Axis didn't. Understanding this interconnection of factors helps explain not just World War II, but broader lessons about power and conflict. Industrial capacity matters. Resources matter. Population matters. Technology matters. Intelligence matters. Leadership matters. Coordination matters. No single factor guarantees victory, but having advantages in multiple areas simultaneously creates overwhelming odds of success. The Allied victory in World War II represented a perfect storm of advantages. Industrial supremacy combined with resource abundance, intelligence superiority, eventual numerical superiority, technological sophistication, effective leadership, and genuine cooperation. Against this combination, Axis tactical skill and temporary advantages couldn't prevail. The war demonstrated that in the industrial age, wars between major powers ultimately come down to which side can produce more, coordinate better, and sustain operations longer. This realization shaped post-war thinking about international security. The United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, and other post-war institutions reflected understanding that preventing future wars required addressing the factors that contributed to this one. Economic integration would make war between major powers less likely. Alliance structures would ensure cooperation against potential aggressors. Nuclear weapons would make total war between major powers too destructive to contemplate. These lessons, learned in blood between 1939 and 45, have shaped the international order for the 8 decades since. So here we are, after this deep exploration into one of history's most consequential conflicts, and we can finally answer our original question: why did the Allies defeat the Axis in World War II? The answer, as we've seen, isn't simple. It's not about one brilliant general or one decisive battle or one technological breakthrough. The real answer is far richer and more complex. The Allies won because they possessed overwhelming industrial capacity, particularly American production, that simply buried the Axis under avalanches of weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies. They won because the Lend-Lease program created a genuinely global coalition where resources flowed to wherever they were most needed. They won because the Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses, refused to break and instead ground down the German war machine in the most savage fighting the world has ever seen. They won because British mathematicians and American codebreakers pierced the veil of enemy communications, giving Allied commanders advantages that enemy leaders never suspected. They won because strategic bombing systematically dismantled the German war economy, particularly the oil production that modern mechanized warfare depended upon. They won because D-Day and the subsequent campaign in Western Europe forced Germany to fight a true two-front war that no amount of tactical skill could win. They won because the Axis powers failed strategically, making catastrophic decisions like invading the Soviet Union without preparation for prolonged war, declaring war on the United States unnecessarily, and completely failing to coordinate their efforts in any meaningful way. They won because the Allies had access to vastly superior resources in oil, food, raw materials, and manpower, advantages that became decisive once the conflict became protracted. They won because Allied political and military leadership, while far from perfect, proved more adaptable, more capable of learning from mistakes, and more willing to cooperate than Axis leadership. And they won because all these factors reinforced each other, creating a synergy where each advantage multiplied the effects of others. But perhaps most fundamentally, the Allies won because they were fighting for something beyond conquest and domination. They were fighting against fascism, against totalitarian aggression, against regimes that had plunged the world into war and committed atrocities on an unprecedented scale. This moral dimension didn't guarantee victory. Military factors still had to align, but it helped sustain Allied populations through years of sacrifice and hardship. The cost of victory was staggering. Perhaps 85 million people died in World War II, the majority of them civilians. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, economies were devastated, societies were traumatized in ways that echoed for generations. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others in industrialized genocide. The Soviet Union lost nearly 30 million people. Poland lost 17% of its population. The atomic bombs incinerated 2 Japanese cities in blinding flashes of nuclear fire. Was victory inevitable? In hindsight, once Britain survived 1940, once the Soviet Union survived 1941, once America entered the war, yes, Allied victory was inevitable, barring some dramatic reversal. The material advantages were simply too overwhelming. But this inevitability wasn't apparent to people at the time. They faced uncertain futures, unknown outcomes, and the very real possibility of defeat and subjugation. Understanding why the Allies won matters because it tells us something important about how the world works. It tells us that determination and courage, while necessary, aren't sufficient without resources and organization to back them up. It tells us that modern industrial warfare is as much about factories and shipping as about battles and generals. It tells us that intelligence and adaptation can multiply material advantages. It tells us that cooperation and coordination between allies can overcome individual weaknesses. It also tells us that totalitarian regimes, for all their supposed efficiency, contain fundamental weaknesses that democratic systems can exploit. The Axis powers, each led by dictators with absolute power, couldn't cooperate effectively, couldn't acknowledge mistakes, couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. The Allied democracies and Soviet system, despite their own flaws, proved more flexible and ultimately more effective. The legacy of Allied victory shaped the world we live in today. The United Nations, for all its imperfections, has helped prevent another world war for 80 years. The Atlantic Alliance that formed during World War II evolved into NATO, which has maintained peace in Europe for 8 decades. The economic institutions created at Bretton Woods fostered unprecedented global prosperity. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild former enemies into democratic allies. The horror of the atomic bomb has prevented major powers from fighting each other directly. But we also inherited darker legacies: the Cold War that followed, decolonization conflicts, regional wars, nuclear proliferation, and continuing ethnic and ideological conflicts. The victory over the Axis didn't create a perfect world. It created our complicated, messy, still troubled world, but one where the particular evil of fascist totalitarianism was defeated and largely discredited. As we close this exploration, remember that history isn't just about dates and battles and statistics. It's about millions of individual stories. The Soviet soldier freezing in a Stalingrad cellar, the American factory worker building her 1,000th aircraft engine, the British codebreaker puzzling over an Enigma message, the French resistance fighter sabotaging a railroad, the Chinese soldier fighting Japanese invaders with inadequate equipment, the merchant seaman sailing through U-boat-infested waters. These individuals, and tens of millions like them, won World War II through their collective efforts, sacrifices, and determination. The real reasons the Allies defeated the Axis come down to this: they had more of what mattered, they used it more effectively, they worked together better, and they refused to surrender even when circumstances looked hopeless. Industrial capacity, intelligence superiority, resource advantages, strategic bombing, the Eastern Front, D-Day, Axis failures, leadership quality. All these mattered, but they mattered because millions of ordinary people made them matter through extraordinary effort. So the next time someone tells you World War II was won because of some single factor, you can smile and tell them it's more complicated than that. You can explain how industrial production, intelligence, resources, strategy, leadership, and cooperation all interlocked to create victory. You can describe how the Eastern Front ground down German military power, while strategic bombing crippled German production, while Lend-Lease sustained Allied armies, while codebreakers gave commanders crucial advantages, while D-Day opened the Western Front. You can explain that wars of this magnitude aren't won by single factors, but by the complex interaction of multiple advantages sustained over years of conflict. And maybe, just maybe, you can help people understand that the lessons of World War II remain relevant today, that international cooperation matters, that democracies, for all their messiness, possess strengths that authoritarian regimes lack, that industrial and economic power remain foundations of military power, that intelligence and information matter as much as weapons, that leadership quality can multiply advantages or squander them, that determination and courage, while necessary, must be backed by resources and strategy. The Allied victory in World War II wasn't inevitable, wasn't easy, and wasn't without cost. But it was achieved through the combination of material advantages, strategic wisdom, operational effectiveness, and sheer determination. It was one of history's greatest collective efforts, undertaken by millions of people across dozens of nations, all working toward the common goal of defeating totalitarian aggression. And that's why the Allies won. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the real reasons behind Allied victory in World War II, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Whispering Wars for more in-depth explorations of military history. Drop a comment below letting me know what aspect of the Allied victory you found most interesting, or what other World War II topics you'd like us to explore. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring history's greatest stories.